Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past Historical Channel. Tonight, you're stepping into a world that no longer exists. A world where the night was genuinely dark, where the last sound before sleep was not a notification or a distant highway, but the slow creak of a settling house, the soft hiss of a candle guttering in a draft, the sound of someone in the next room turning over beneath heavy wool blankets. Tonight, we are going to spend a very long time inside the bedrooms, boarding houses, nurseries, and quiet parlors of the 19th century. We are going to follow people as they move towards sleep, not the dramatic moments of history, not the wars and the elections and the revolutions, but the small, ordinary, deeply human act of lying down and closing one's eyes. And as you settle in yourself, as you let the quiet of this moment wrap around you, I want you to know that what you are about to hear is true. These customs existed, these people lived, these rooms were real, so let the evening come, let the light grow soft, and step gently into the 19th century night. Before we go any further, if you have found your way to this channel, and this kind of slow, quiet storytelling is something you enjoy, the kind that asks nothing of you except to listen, then consider subscribing. There are many more evenings like this one waiting for you here. No pressure, no urgency. Just a gentle suggestion, offered in the spirit of a good host who hopes you will come back. And now, without any further interruption, let us begin. The architecture of darkness, how the 19th century night was built to understand how people of the 19th century slept. You first have to understand what the 19th century night actually felt and looked and sounded like, because it was not like our nights. Not at all. When the sun went down in, say, 1840, it really went down. The darkness that followed was of a quality that most people living today have never experienced and can barely imagine. In a rural farmhouse in Devon, or in a small town in Ohio, or in a tenement in Edinburgh, when night fell and the last lamp was put out or the last candle was snuffed, the darkness that descended was absolute. Not the muted, ambient darkness of a modern bedroom where the glow of a streetlight still slips under the curtain. Not the kind of dark interrupted by the orange pulse of a passing car. This was a darkness that had weight to it, a darkness you could feel pressing against your open eyes. And that darkness, that profound, unapologetic darkness, shaped everything about how people understood sleep, prepared for sleep, feared sleep, and experienced it. Let us begin at the beginning of a typical 19th century evening. Let us say we are somewhere in England, because England is a useful place to start. It is a country well documented, well written about, with diaries and household manuals and etiquette guides and medical pamphlets that tell us, in surprising detail, exactly how ordinary people arrange their evenings and their nights. The year is, let us say, 1855. The place is a modest but respectable household, not grand, not poor. The kind of home where there is a cook and perhaps one housemaid, where the family eats dinner at a set time, where there are children in the upstairs rooms and parents who take their responsibilities to those children seriously. Dinner has been cleared. The evening has settled in. In the parlor, the fire is burning low. It has been burning since afternoon, and by this hour, say 8 o'clock in winter, it has burned down to a slow, amber pulse. The coals shift occasionally with a soft crack, and when they do, the light in the room shifts with them, throwing brief shadows up the walls and then pulling them back again. The lamps are lit. They are oil lamps in this period, in this kind of home, probably burning colza oil or whale oil, or perhaps the newer kerosene, which has been coming into fashion since the 1850s. The light they give is warmer than gaslight, more golden, and it has a quality of softness that even the most expensive modern lamp cannot quite replicate. It moves, it breathes, it is alive in a way that electric light has never managed to be. The family is gathered in this light. The father might be reading or reviewing accounts, or perhaps simply sitting with his eyes half closed in the particular posture of a man who has worked hard and is allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. The mother is almost certainly occupied with handwork, embroidery, or mending, or knitting, the needle or the hook moving with the automatic rhythm of a task so practiced it requires almost no conscious attention. The older children, if allowed to stay up, might be reading quietly or playing a slow game of cards or writing letters. The younger children are already in bed. This is the drawing room in its evening configuration. It is a room arranged specifically for this kind of gentle evening occupation. The chairs are positioned to take advantage of the firelight and the lamplight simultaneously. There is often a small side table near the best chair with a good lamp positioned just so, angled to fall over the reader's shoulder. The heavier curtains have been drawn against the cold and the dark outside, and the room has achieved a kind of sealed warmth that feels, in retrospect, almost unbearably cozy. The sounds of this room are very specific. The occasional pop of the fire, the scratch of a pen. The click of knitting needles. Perhaps if the family is musical, someone has played earlier in the evening. The piano is still open, its keys gleaming dully in the low light, but by this hour the playing has stopped. What remains is the quiet, the particular quiet of a household winding down, where noise itself is becoming impolite. Outside, if you were to open the curtains and look, you would see almost nothing. On a cloudy night, there might be no moon, no stars. On a clear night, the stars would be extraordinary, the Milky Way visible as a genuine smear of light across the sky, the individual stars bright and sharp in a way they simply are not in any sky contaminated by electric light. But the world between the house and those stars, the lane, the garden wall, the fields beyond, would be effectively invisible. There might be the distant light of another house, 100 yards away, a warm orange square in the dark. There might be the sound of an animal, an owl, or a cow settling in its barn, but the sense of distance from other people, from other warmth, from other light would be absolute. And this is important. It is important because that darkness and that distance shaped the psychology of sleep in the 19th century in ways that we have almost entirely lost. People were not afraid of the dark in the way that children are afraid of the dark, as a vague, unfocused anxiety. Or rather, some people were, but in addition to that, the darkness had a practical quality that made the management of nighttime a genuine logistical concern. You could not simply decide, at 10 o'clock, that you wanted a glass of water and walk downstairs in the dark without risk of falling. You could not simply reach over and turn on a lamp. You needed a candle, and to light a candle, you needed a match or a flint, and to find those things in the dark, you needed to have put them somewhere reliable before the light went out. The management of light was, in the 19th century household, a serious domestic art. Every bedroom had on the nightstand or on a small table by the door, a candlestick, usually a simple brass or tin affair with a small round handle and a drip guard, along with a box of matches. In wealthier homes, these might be replaced by a small oil lamp, but the principle was the same. You did not go to bed without your means of making light within arm's reach, because in the middle of the night, if you woke and needed to move, you needed that light, and people did wake, frequently. This is something that historians of sleep, and there are historians of sleep, which is a delightful fact, have documented extensively in the past few decades. The notion that human beings naturally sleep in one long, unbroken stretch of 7 or 8 hours is actually a relatively modern idea, one that corresponds almost perfectly with the spread of artificial lighting. Before electric light, before even gas lamps, the natural pattern of human sleep appears to have been quite different. People went to bed early by our standards, often between 8 and 10 in the evening, shortly after full dark, and they slept for about 4 hours. Then they woke up. This waking in historical documents is referred to as the time between sleeps, or sometimes simply as the watch. It lasted anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. During this time, people did all kinds of things. They prayed, they talked to their spouses or to other members of the household. They got up and ate a small amount of food or drank some ale or wine. They smoked a pipe if they were the kind of person who smoked a pipe. In summer, they might go outside and walk in the garden under the stars. Some people used this quiet middle of the night window to read by candlelight or to write in a journal. Doctors of the period recommended this time as ideal for lovemaking, on the grounds that both partners were rested from their first sleep and not yet fatigued by the demands of the day. After this period of waking, this strange, private, interior window in the middle of the night, people returned to sleep for their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This pattern of segmented sleep, sometimes called biphasic sleep by modern researchers, was apparently so normal in the pre-industrial world that there are references to it scattered throughout the literature of centuries. Medieval monks built their religious schedules around it, planning a prayer service called matins for the hours between first and second sleep. The French had a phrase for it, premier sommeil, which appears in literary texts from the 14th century onward. And in 19th century England, particularly in the early part of the century before gas lighting became widespread, the pattern was still very much alive, especially in rural households and among the poor, who went to bed earlier and whose lives were more closely governed by the movements of the sun. But let us not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let us stay in the evening. Let us watch as the household begins very slowly to prepare for sleep. It is now perhaps 9 o'clock. Perhaps 9:30. The fire in the parlor has been banked, meaning the remaining coals have been pushed together and covered with a layer of ash or a metal guard, which will slow their burning and prevent sparks from escaping onto the rug while the family sleeps. This is a task performed every night without fail, because a house fire is among the most feared events in 19th century life, and the memory of houses lost to unattended fires is always present in the minds of careful householders. The father rises first. He takes up his candle, already lit from the parlor lamp, and says his good nights. The candle lights his way up the stairs, casting a moving, elongated shadow ahead of him on the wall. He moves through the house toward the bedroom, and as he goes, the rooms behind him are left in whatever dim residual glow remains from the fire or from the lamp his wife still tends. The stairs are worth pausing on for a moment. They are almost certainly uncarpeted in their upper reaches. Carpet was expensive, and in most households it was reserved for the main staircase and the public rooms. The upper stairs and the back passages might be bare wood, and they creak. They creak in very specific ways. Each step has its own voice, and the members of the household know these voices intimately. They know which stairs to avoid when trying not to wake the children. They have memorized, over years of daily use, the exact placement of their feet required to move through their own home in near silence. The bedroom, when the father reaches it, is cold. This is another thing that is almost impossible for most modern readers to truly absorb. The bedroom was cold. In most 19th century households, the bedroom was not heated, or not reliably heated, and in winter, the air in an unheated room in an English or Scottish or New England house could be genuinely, bitingly cold. Not uncomfortable commute cold, not forgot my jacket cold, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough that the water in the wash basin by the window sometimes had a thin skin of ice on it by morning. The bed itself was designed, partly, as a response to this cold. The mattresses of the period were thick and heavy, often filled with a combination of straw at the bottom for firmness and feathers above for softness, and they were covered with multiple layers of bedding. There would be a bottom sheet, a top sheet, wool blankets, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, and over all of this, a heavy coverlet or quilt. In very cold weather, there might also be a feather bed laid on top of the sleeper, a kind of secondary mattress filled with down that could weigh several pounds and was extraordinarily effective at trapping body heat. Getting into this bed, particularly in winter, was a ritual of its own. The bed had to be warmed before you could comfortably slide between the cold sheets. For this purpose, many households used a bed warmer, a long-handled pan, usually made of copper or brass, with a hinged lid, which was filled with hot coals from the fire, and then moved in slow sweeping motions between the sheets to drive out the cold. The bed warmer was one of the great domestic tools of the era, familiar to every household that could afford one, and the task of warming the beds was often assigned to a specific servant or to the housewife herself, performed as part of the last duties of the evening. In households that could not afford a bed warmer, which included a great many households, people used other methods. Heated bricks wrapped in flannel were placed at the foot of the bed. Earthenware jugs filled with hot water, the ancestors of the rubber hot water bottle, which would not appear until the 1870s, were tucked under the coverlet. In very poor households, there might be nothing more than the accumulated body heat of the people sleeping together, which in a family of 6 sharing a single bed was actually quite effective. The bed in the 19th century was not primarily a piece of furniture. It was a sanctuary. It was the warmest place in the house. It was the place where you were most yourself, where you were hidden from the demands of work and society and appearance. It was the place where you were born and where, in all probability, you would die. The bed was a world unto itself, and the act of entering it at the end of a long day was not just a practical necessity. It had something of the character of a homecoming. Let us pause here for a moment in the bedroom. The candle has been set on the nightstand. The room is lit by its small, trembling flame, and the shadows it casts are deep and mobile. The window, assuming there is one, is almost certainly covered by heavy drapes in a wealthier household, by a simple wooden shutter in a simpler one. The draft, if there is a draft, moves along the floor near the baseboards. The air smells of cold plaster, of the faint residue of smoke from the candle, of the particular smell of wool and feather and linen that a much-used bed develops over time, and that is, to those who know it, one of the most reassuring smells in the world. The candle will not burn all night. Candles were expensive, not extraordinarily expensive, but expensive enough that leaving one burning through the night was considered wasteful in most households. So the candle serves a specific, limited purpose. It provides light while the preparations for sleep are made, and then it is extinguished. Some households used very small candles, specifically sized to burn out within about 15 minutes of being lit, a kind of built-in timer ensuring that the room would not be lit after the household had settled. The preparations for sleep in the 19th century were more elaborate than we might expect. There was washing to be done. The wash basin and pitcher on the dresser were the center of this ritual, a bowl of cold water, or warm water carried up from the kitchen if the household was particular about such things, and a cake of soap. People washed their faces and their hands, and sometimes more, depending on their temperament and the customs of their household. The question of bathing, of full-body washing, was a complicated one in the 19th century, and we will return to it in considerable detail later in this evening's discussion. There was hair to be attended to. Women in the 19th century typically wore their hair pinned up during the day, and the unpinning of the hair at bedtime was one of the small, private rituals of the evening. The pins were removed and placed carefully in a dish. These were reused, and losing pins was a minor domestic annoyance, and the hair was then brushed out. The brushing of hair at bedtime was considered not only practically necessary to prevent tangles and maintain condition, but also medically beneficial. Victorian medical writers recommended vigorous brushing of the scalp as a promoter of sleep and general health, and the 100-stroke regimen for hair brushing, 100 strokes, counted carefully before bed, was a widely repeated piece of domestic wisdom. Men too had their preparations. The collar and cravat, worn throughout the day, were removed and laid out for the morning. Shoes were unlaced and set by the door. In more prosperous households, a valet or a housemaid might have already laid out the nightclothes. The nightshirt, for men, which was a garment that might strike modern eyes as curious in its length and fullness, but was perfectly adapted to the cold of an unheated room. Nightclothes in the 19th century were not like modern pajamas. They were not casual or colorful or thin. They were serious garments, made of heavy flannel or thick cotton, designed primarily to keep the sleeper warm. The nightgown for women could be an elaborate affair, heavily stitched, with long sleeves and a high neck, while the nightshirt for men was simpler but equally substantial. In the early part of the century, sleeping in one's day clothes, or in very little at all, was not unheard of among the poor, but by mid-century, the idea that one had specific garments designated for sleep had become sufficiently widespread that the absence of them was noted as a sign of poverty or eccentricity. The nightcap, the soft fabric cap worn on the head during sleep, is a garment that has become something of a comic symbol, associated with Christmas illustrations and with a certain caricature of the drowsy Victorian gentleman. But the nightcap was genuinely practical, and for most of the 19th century, it was genuinely worn. The head during sleep is the primary site of heat loss in a cold environment, and in a cold bedroom, a nightcap could make a meaningful difference in comfort. They were worn by men and women both, though by mid-century, they had begun to fall out of fashion among men of the younger, more progressive generation. All of these preparations, the washing the hair, the changing of clothes, took time, perhaps 15 minutes, perhaps half an hour. And during this time, the candle burned and the room remained in that warm, intimate, golden light. And then the preparations were complete, and then it was time. The sleeper would pull back the layers of bedding, the heavy quilt, the wool blankets, the top sheet, and would slide between them, gathering the warmth of the preheated bed around them. The sheets, even with a bed warmer, would be cool at first against the legs, and then less cool and then warm. The candle would be blown out, and the darkness would come, not gradually, not in the slow, dimming way of a modern light switch, instantly, completely. One breath the world was lit by a small, trembling flame, and the next breath there was nothing, just the darkness, just the quiet, just the slow, organic sounds of a house settling into its nighttime self, the creak of a joist, the tap of a branch against the window, the wind in the chimney, and beneath all of it, the soft, steady sound of breathing. This is where we begin, in the dark, in the warmth, at the end of the day. What people wore to bed: nightclothes, nightcaps, and the etiquette of the sleeping body if you were to open a middle-class Victorian woman's dresser drawer, which is, admittedly, a strange thing to imagine doing, but stay with me, you would find, among the carefully folded and ironed contents, a number of garments that belonged entirely to the night. They were kept separate from the day clothes. They were laundered on a different schedule. They represented, in fabric form, a completely different register of life. The nightgown was the primary garment, and it was a garment that varied enormously depending on the social position, the decade, the season, and the preferences of its wearer. In the early 19th century, say, in the years just after 1800, nightgowns for women of the middle and upper classes were often surprisingly thin and light by later standards. The fashion of the Regency period, with its emphasis on classical drapery and natural form, extended even into the bedroom. A nightgown from 1810 might be made of fine white muslin, almost translucent, with a gathered neckline and simple drawstring at the neck. It was a beautiful garment in its own way, but not a warm one. By the 1830s, and certainly by the 1840s, as the Victorian period settled into its characteristic aesthetic, which valued coverage, warmth, modesty, and what might be called the moral weight of fabric, the nightgown had become a more serious proposition. Flannel was the preferred material for winter nightgowns, and flannel nightgowns were long, often reaching the floor, with high necks, long sleeves, and a row of small buttons at the throat. They were sometimes trimmed with a narrow braid or a modest edging of lace, because even in sleep, the Victorian woman was expected to be appropriately dressed, and appropriate dressing always involved some small acknowledgement of feminine decoration. There were summer nightgowns and winter nightgowns, kept in separate drawers or in different sections of the wardrobe. The summer gown might be cotton lawn, cooler and lighter. The winter gown might be the heavy flannel. Some women had intermediate gowns for the uncertain weeks of spring and autumn, when the weather could not make up its mind and neither could the sleeper. The care of nightgowns was its own domestic science. They were washed regularly, weekly, in most respectable households, and they were ironed with care. Nightgowns were ironed. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea of ironing a garment that would be worn in bed, invisible to everyone except one's spouse, and in a crisis, one's physician, seems to us like an extraordinary investment of effort. But in the 19th century, the standard of household management was such that garments were ironed because ironed garments were correct, and correct was the baseline expectation regardless of whether anyone was watching. The nightcap we have already mentioned, but it deserves a fuller treatment because it is a more interesting garment than its comic reputation suggests. A Victorian nightcap was usually made of white cotton or muslin, and it was constructed to fit snugly over the head and ears. In the early part of the century, they could be quite elaborate, trimmed with ribbon, embroidered at the brim, sometimes starched to hold a particular shape. By the 1850s and 1860s, they had become simpler, plainer, but no less ubiquitous in the households that used them. Women's nightcaps often had long ties that fastened under the chin, keeping the cap from slipping during sleep and also keeping the ears warm. Men's nightcaps were less fitted, sometimes conical, sometimes simple gathered bags with a tassel at the top. The reasons for wearing a nightcap were both practical and, by mid-century, beginning to be medically contested. The practical reason was warmth. The head loses heat rapidly in a cold environment, and at night, with the covers pulled up to the chin and the uncovered head left exposed to the cold air, a nightcap was a genuinely useful thing. Medical writers had for centuries recommended covering the head during sleep, citing the supposed danger of cold air reaching the brain. This fear of cold night air in general, and of cold air on the head in particular, was a significant feature of 19th century medical thinking, and we will return to it in detail. But by the middle of the century, the medical opinion on nightcaps was beginning to shift. A new school of thought, associated with the emerging interest in ventilation and fresh air as health-promoting rather than health-threatening, began to suggest that the nightcap was actually harmful, that covering the head during sleep interfered with the natural emanation of heat from the scalp and prevented the proper circulation of air around the brain. These were not well-founded arguments by modern standards, but they were argued with great confidence, and gradually they won. By the 1870s and 1880s, the nightcap was becoming associated with old age and old-fashionedness, and among younger men especially, it was increasingly abandoned. Children, however, wore nightcaps longer. Children in the Victorian nursery were kept warm by a comprehensive system of nightclothing that would astonish a modern parent. Nightcap, the flannel nightgown, and often an additional layer of flannel wrapped around the chest or the midsection, called a flannel band, were all standard components of the nursery nighttime wardrobe. The flannel band in particular was considered essential for the protection of the delicate digestive organs during sleep. It was believed that the stomach and the intestines were especially vulnerable to cold during the night, and that failing to protect them could lead to colic, diarrhea, and other complaints. This belief was held with absolute conviction by most parents and most physicians, and it is reflected in the household manuals and parenting guides of the period with the force of received wisdom. For men, the situation was somewhat simpler, but followed the same broad logic. The nightshirt, long, white, flannel, or cotton, was the standard garment, and it was almost universal among men of the middle class. It was a garment of considerable length, reaching at least to the knee and often to the ankle, providing warmth to the legs without restricting movement. The sleeves were long. The collar might be simply hemmed or might have a small placket with a button or two at the throat. The poor, as always, had a different experience. In working-class households, the division between day clothes and night clothes was not always so clear. Particularly for men and boys who worked in physical labor, factory workers, farm laborers, dockers, the nightshirt might be a luxury. It was not uncommon for working men to sleep in their shirts, their day shirts, which were worn under their outer clothes and served simultaneously as undergarments, and when the outer layers were stripped away as nightwear. This was practical but not ideal, particularly since the shirts absorbed the sweat and grime of a working day and were then slept in. The growing public health movement of the mid-Victorian period was very concerned about this, associating the habit of sleeping in work-soiled clothing with the spread of disease and the general degradation of the working classes. Reformers wrote about it with a combination of medical concern and moral disapproval that was characteristic of the era. In slums and very overcrowded lodgings, the situation could be grimmer still. There are accounts from social investigators of the period, people like Henry Mayhew in London, or the reporters who contributed to the great surveys of working-class life, of lodging houses where men slept in their outdoor coats for warmth, pulling the coat over them like a blanket, still wearing the boots that had carried them through a day's work on wet cobblestones. But we are getting ahead of ourselves into the complexities of class, which we will return to. For now, let us stay with the comfortable middle-class bedroom, where the nightgown is smooth and clean and the nightcap is properly tied, and the layers of the bed are arranged with the care of someone who takes their sleep seriously. Because in the 19th century, sleep was taken seriously. It was understood as something to be cultivated, managed, and protected, not simply something that happened to you when you closed your eyes. The Victorian Household Manual, that great institution, of which Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management is only the most famous example, devoted considerable space to the question of sleep and bedtime preparations. The reader was advised on the proper time to go to bed, not too late, 10 o'clock at the very latest for anyone who wished to preserve their health. The the proper temperature of the bedroom, cool but not cold. The idea of a sealed, centrally heated bedroom was not yet in fashion, and was, in fact, specifically warned against. The proper arrangement of the bedding, blankets, and not feather beds for most of the year, since feather beds were held to induce too heavy a sleep and to cause morning headaches, and the proper state of mind with which to approach sleep, calm, grateful, and at peace with one's conscience. The last point, the proper state of mind for sleep, was treated as seriously as any of the physical preparations. Sleep, in 19th century medical and moral thinking, was intimately connected to the conscience. The idea that a guilty or troubled mind could not sleep properly was not merely a metaphor, it was a medical conviction. Physicians wrote about anxiety, guilt, and mental disturbance as causes of insomnia, and the prescription they offered was not pharmacological but moral. Resolve your debts, make peace with your enemies, pray sincerely, and you will sleep. The connection between moral rectitude and physical health, and specifically sleep health, was deeply embedded in the culture of the period. Evening prayers, which were practiced in most middle-class Christian households of the century, served this function explicitly. The family would gather before bed, sometimes in the parlor, sometimes in the bedroom, sometimes at the children's bedsides, for a brief prayer that explicitly commended the sleepers to God's protection and asked for peace during the night. The content of these prayers was not incidental. They addressed the anxieties of the night, the darkness, the vulnerability of sleep, the possibility of death before morning, and they placed those anxieties within a framework that made them manageable. You were going to sleep, yes, and you were leaving the waking world, yes, and you were vulnerable, yes, but you were in good hands. The night held no threat that prayer could not address. This connection between prayer, sleep, and the preparation of the soul was not unique to the Victorian period, of course. It stretches back through centuries of Christian practice, but it had in the 19th century a particular intensity, a particular domestic quality, that was the product of the era's characteristic focus on the home as the center of moral life. The bedroom was not just where you slept. It was where your soul prepared itself for the unknowable hours of darkness. And as the prayers were said, and the candle was extinguished, and the darkness settled in, that complete, absolute pre-electric darkness, the sleeper in their flannel nightgown and their tied nightcap would pull the heavy wool blankets up to their chin, and if all was well, if the mind was calm and the conscience clear and the body warm, would close their eyes. The bedroom itself, architecture, furniture, air, and the geography of sleep, and as the night deepens, let us take a long, slow look at the room itself. The Victorian bedroom, and we are using Victorian loosely here, to encompass the broader 19th century across England, and in time, America, was a room designed around the bed in a way that our modern bedrooms, for all their nominal similarity, are not. The bed was not simply the largest piece of furniture. It was the architectural center of the room, the thing around which everything else was arranged, the reason the room existed. To walk into a Victorian bedroom was to walk into a room that had been built, furnished, and organized in explicit service of the act of sleep. The bed frame itself was often very substantial. The most common form in the early and middle part of the century was the four-poster, a bed with four tall posts at its corners, from which curtains could be hung. By the Victorian period, the curtains of the four-poster had a long history behind them, stretching back to the medieval period when they had served a very practical function. In large, unheated rooms, particularly in castles and manor houses, the curtain bed created a small enclosed environment that retained the heat of the sleepers' bodies and blocked the drafts that moved freely through the larger space. By the 19th century, the practical necessity of the curtain bed had diminished. Bedrooms were smaller and more enclosed, the curtains no longer essential for warmth, but the custom persisted, partly for tradition and partly for privacy, and partly because the enclosed curtained bed created a particular quality of intimacy and darkness that many people simply preferred. These curtains were usually heavy velvet or thick wool in wealthy households, a stouter cotton or even serge in more modest ones, and they were lined. They hung from rings on the posts and could be drawn closed on all four sides, creating a complete enclosure. At night, with the curtains drawn, the sleeper inside the curtain bed was isolated from the room in the most thorough possible way, unable to see, unable to hear except through the muffled filter of the heavy fabric, cocooned in the accumulated warmth of the enclosed space. It was, by all accounts, extraordinarily comfortable once you were inside, though it raised medical concerns that we will discuss shortly. Not every household had a four-poster, of course. The half-tester bed, which had a canopy over the head end only, without curtains on the sides or foot, was also common, particularly as the century progressed and the fashion for full enclosure began to decline. And in working-class households, there was simply the bed, a wooden frame, a simple headboard, no posts, no curtains, which was the bed most people in England and America actually slept in. The placement of the bed within the room was considered carefully, and the Victorian household manuals had strong opinions about it. The ideal placement, according to most authorities, was not against the wall but pulled slightly away from it, to allow air to circulate around all sides. The head of the bed should face north or east, depending on which authority you consulted. There was a lively and largely unresolvable debate about the optimal orientation of the sleeping body relative to the Earth's magnetic field, which was believed by some to have a significant effect on the quality of sleep. The bed should not be directly under a window drafts or directly next to a fireplace excessive heat, and should not be placed in line with a door, lest the draft created by its opening disturb the sleeper. The other furniture of the bedroom was arranged in service of the before bed and after sleep rituals. The washstand, a small table with a marble top or a wooden top with cutouts for a basin and pitcher, stood against one wall, usually the one with the most morning light. The dresser or chest of drawers stood against another wall, its mirror, if it had one, angled to catch whatever light was available. The wardrobe, that great Victorian institution, stood against the third wall, a heavy, imposing piece of furniture with deep shelves and hanging space for the elaborate clothing of the period. And the nightstand, which was not always a table but might be a small cabinet with a drawer and a shelf below, stood beside the bed, holding the candle, the matches, the glass of water, the Bible, the current book, and whatever small medicinal preparations the sleeper required. The floor of the bedroom was usually wooden, broad planks of pine or oak in older houses, narrower boards in newer ones, and it was covered, in the area around the bed, with a rug. Rug was important, not merely as decoration, but as a practical measure against the cold of the floor. Getting out of bed on a winter morning to step onto a cold wooden floor was unpleasant in a sharp, immediate physical way that anyone who has ever done it will recognize, and the bedroom rug, hooked or woven or braided, placed on the cold side of the bed where the feet would land, was one of the small, practical comforts that distinguished a well-ordered household from an improvised one. The walls of a Victorian bedroom were typically papered. Wallpaper had become, by mid-century, affordable enough for the middle classes, and it was used throughout the house, including the bedroom. The patterns were often large, not the small, discrete patterns that we associate with calm bedroom environments today, but large-scale repeating patterns of flowers, leaves, geometric shapes, or architectural motifs. The colors were often strong, deep reds, greens, blues, patterns that would strike many modern eyes as overwhelming in a sleeping space. But in a room lit primarily by candlelight, these strong colors and large patterns read quite differently than they do under the flat, all-pervasive light of modern electric bulbs. In candlelight, a deep crimson wallpaper becomes simply warm. A pattern of large green leaves becomes a kind of forest, glimpsed dimly at the edge of the light. There was frequently a fireplace in the bedroom, though whether it was lit was another matter. In middle-class households, the bedroom fire was considered something of a luxury, and it was lit in winter primarily when the resident was ill, when a new baby had been born in the room, which happened frequently, or when the weather was so severe that even the most Spartan household acknowledged the necessity of warmth. The servants who managed the fires, and a household with servants had fires as a central management challenge, would bring coal or wood to the bedroom fire in the late afternoon, preparing it to be lit in the evening if needed. The bedroom fire, when lit, created a warmth and a dancing light quite different from the parlor fire, smaller, more intimate, filling the room with its orange glow and its particular smell of burning coal and hot iron grate. But let us talk about air. In the 19th century, the question of air, its quality, its movement, its composition, its relationship to health, was one of the great medical preoccupations of the era. The mid-century discovery of germ theory was a long and contested process, and in the decades before it was widely understood and accepted, the dominant medical framework for understanding disease was miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused not by microscopic organisms but by bad air, particularly the foul vapors rising from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, and decomposing material. Miasma theory had a profound effect on how people thought about the air in their bedrooms. On one side of the debate were the traditionalists, those who believed, in accordance with ancient medical wisdom, that the night air was intrinsically dangerous. Cold air, night air, damp air, all of these were believed to harbor miasmas that could infiltrate the lungs and cause illness. The appropriate response was to seal the bedroom, close the windows, draw the curtains, ensure that no draft could reach the sleeping body. In an extreme version of this view, even the exhalations of other people sleeping in the same room were considered potentially harmful, a reason why sleeping alone was sometimes recommended for those with delicate constitutions. This belief in the danger of night air is usually treated with condescension by modern writers, as though it were a simple and embarrassing piece of Victorian foolishness, but it is worth noting that the concern was not entirely baseless. Before germ theory provided a more accurate understanding of disease transmission, the observation that disease spread more rapidly at night, in enclosed spaces, and in places with stagnant air was accurate. The mechanism was wrong, but the correlation was real. Malaria, whose name means, literally, bad air, is indeed associated with swampy, low-lying areas with poor air movement, because those are the areas where the mosquitoes that carry it breed. The miasma theory pointed to the right places even while misidentifying the cause. On the other side of the bedroom air debate were the reformers, the ventilationists, we might call them, who argued that the real danger lay not in fresh air but in the lack of it. They pointed out correctly that a sealed bedroom in which several people slept all night was rapidly depleted of oxygen and filled with the carbon dioxide exhaled by the sleepers. They argued that the foul smell of a shut bedroom in the morning was itself evidence of its unhealthiness, and they advocated strongly for open windows, ventilation gaps, and the habit of sleeping with at least a small aperture of fresh air available. The most famous of these ventilationists in the English context was Florence Nightingale, whose Notes on Nursing, published in 1860, devoted considerable energy to the question of bedroom air. Her views were passionate and categorical. The room of a sick person must be kept ventilated. Fresh air was essential to recovery. The practice of sealing windows and curtains to protect patients from night air was not merely misguided, but actively harmful. She wrote with characteristic directness about the maddening practice of keeping sick rooms stifling and airless in the name of warmth, and her voice was influential enough to begin shifting medical and popular opinion in the direction of ventilation. Between these two poles, the sealed bedroom and the ventilated bedroom, most actual households of the 19th century occupied a complicated middle ground. Some people opened the window a crack, on the side away from the prevailing wind. Some opened the bedroom door but kept the window shut, relying on the air moving through the house rather than coming directly from outside. Some sealed the room completely and hoped for the best. And some, particularly in areas where genuine miasmas existed, near marshes, near sewage outlets, near tanneries or other industries, kept their bedrooms very sealed indeed, for reasons that, given the environmental context, were not irrational. This question of air in the bedroom is connected to one of the most striking features of Victorian bedroom design that is, for the modern eye, perhaps the most unexpected: the number of objects in the bedroom that were covered. The Victorians had a strong custom of covering things in the bedroom overnight. The wash basin, with its cloth cover to keep dust out of the water. The mirror, often covered with a light cloth, a custom that had both practical, preventing condensation, and slightly superstitious, mirrors at night, in some folk belief, were gateways, dimensions. Food, if food was brought to the bedroom, was covered. The fireplace with its screen. Even the nightstand sometimes had a small cloth laid over it. This culture of covering was partly about dust. Houses of the period generated enormous quantities of dust, from coal fires, from unpaved roads, from the coal smoke that hung over every city and many towns, and housekeeping was largely a constant war against it. Covering things overnight reduced the surface area available for dust to settle. But it also had a quality of ritual to it, of the household tucking itself in for the night just as its residents tucked themselves into their beds. The house, like the body, needed to be made ready for the long hours of darkness. One more thing deserves mention in our tour of the Victorian bedroom, and it is perhaps the most intimate object in the room, the one that is least discussed in polite modern company, and yet it was absolutely central to the nightly routine: the chamber pot. Indoor plumbing, the ability to walk from one's bedroom down a corridor to a water closet at 2 in the morning, was, for most of the 19th century, available only to a very small and very wealthy minority. Even in cities, even in reasonably prosperous households, it was not unusual for the toilet facilities to be located outside, in a privy at the back of the yard, or at the very best in an indoor water closet added to the house some time after its original construction, which might be down 2 flights of stairs and around a corner. Getting up from a warm bed on a cold night, going downstairs, navigating through a dark house, and going outside to a privy in the rain was a sufficiently unpleasant prospect that the chamber pot had been, for centuries, the practical solution. And in the 19th century, the chamber pot was still very much a bedroom fixture. It lived under the bed, specifically under the sleeper's side of the bed, enclosed often in a small wooden cabinet called a commode or a night commode, which looked, when closed, like an ordinary piece of bedroom furniture. The removal and emptying of the chamber pot was one of the morning duties of the housemaid, part of the routine of the house that was accomplished while the family was at breakfast, and which everyone knew about and no one discussed. The chamber pot was made of ceramic, white or cream, or decorated with a simple blue pattern, and it was substantial, heavy, designed to last for years. In some households, particularly in the earlier part of the century, it had a matching lid which reduced odor. In grander households, the chamber pot might be of fine porcelain, decorated, part of a matched bedroom set that included the basin, the pitcher, the soap dish, and the tooth powder jar. The intimacy implied by the chamber pot, the fact that this object, which was used at the most private moments of the night, was part of the household's daily management, known to the servants who emptied it, potentially visible to anyone who entered the room, is one of the ways in which the Victorian bedroom was, in spite of all its emphasis on privacy and decorum, a more communal space than the modern bedroom. The bedroom was private from the world outside the household. Within the household, it was managed, maintained, and served by others in ways that required a certain frank acknowledgement of bodily reality that the elaborate linguistic decorum of the Victorian era was otherwise so determined to avoid. And with all of this in mind, the chamber pot, the nightcap, the cold air question, the heavy curtains, the flickering candle, the hot coals in the warming pan, we have a picture of a bedroom that is, in almost every sense, foreign to our experience. A room that is colder than any room we willingly occupy. A room that is darker than any darkness we normally encounter. A room that requires active management and preparation to make comfortable. A room that is, in its furniture and its objects and its customs, shaped by a completely different understanding of the body, of health, and of what sleep requires. And yet the person who climbed into that bed, in that cold room, in that absolute darkness, with their flannel nightgown and their tied nightcap and their conscience hopefully at rest, they were not having a worse experience of sleep than we are. In many ways, the evidence suggests they were having a better one. The problem of insomnia, what the 19th century did when sleep would not come there, were of course nights when sleep did not come. When the preparations were complete and the prayers were said and the candle was extinguished and the darkness descended, and yet the mind kept moving, kept thinking, kept rehearsing the events of the day or the worries of the morrow or the long unresolved question that had been sitting at the back of the consciousness like a stone in a shoe, not painful enough to stop and address during the busy daylight hours, but suddenly, in the silence of the night, impossible to ignore. Insomnia, the difficulty of sleeping when sleep is desired, is not a modern invention. It is as old as consciousness itself, and the 19th century was intimately familiar with it. What is striking, looking at the historical record, is not that people suffered from insomnia, but how differently they understood and responded to it. The modern approach to insomnia, clinical, pharmacological, often involving a consultation with a specialist and the prescription of a drug, would have been largely incomprehensible to a Victorian. Not because they were uninterested in treatment, they were extremely interested, and 19th century physicians wrote extensively about insomnia and its cures, but because the framework within which they understood the problem was so different from ours. In the 19th century, insomnia was understood primarily as a symptom rather than a condition in its own right. It was the signal that something else was wrong, something in the body, something in the mind, or something in the moral life of the sufferer. The question was never simply, how do I make you sleep? But rather, what is preventing you from sleeping, and how do we address that underlying cause? The causes identified by 19th century physicians were various and sometimes surprising. Indigestion was considered a major culprit. The stomach, working too hard on a heavy or badly chosen supper, was held to disturb the nervous system and prevent the relaxation necessary for sleep. This belief was not entirely wrong. We now understand that certain foods, particularly spicy, fatty, or acidic ones consumed close to bedtime, can indeed interfere with sleep quality. But the Victorian understanding extended this connection much further, attributing to the stomach a role in the regulation of sleep that we would now assign to the brain. A good supper, lightly consumed, eaten early in the evening, and allowed to digest fully before bed, was the first prescription offered by almost every Victorian medical writer on the subject of sleep. Overstimulation was another major cause. The brain, particularly the brain of the educated, professional, ambitious 19th century man or woman, was susceptible to overstimulation, to the accumulation of too many impressions, too many thoughts, too much intellectual activity in the hours before sleep. The recommendation was to wind down the mental activity gradually in the evening. No serious reading or difficult intellectual work after dinner. No heated conversation or argument in the final hours before bed. Instead, gentle social intercourse, light reading, music, and the gradual slowing of the mental machinery toward the quiet receptivity appropriate for sleep. This advice, offered in Victorian household manuals with the authority of medical science behind it, is remarkably similar to what sleep hygiene experts recommend today, which suggests that the observation, if not always the explanation, was accurate. Anxiety and worry, what the Victorians sometimes called nervous prostration or brain fever in more acute forms, were recognized as powerful disruptors of sleep, and here the Victorian response diverges most clearly from our own. Where we might recommend therapy or anxiolytic medication or mindfulness practice, the Victorian physician was more likely to prescribe a combination of practical and moral remedies, address the source of the worry if it is addressable, If it is not, practice submission to providence. Engage in regular exercise during the day to tire the body appropriately. Adopt a regular bedtime schedule. And if all else fails, try a warm bath. The warm bath as a sleep aid was recommended by Victorian physicians with great enthusiasm. The theory was that the warm water drew blood to the surface of the skin, away from the brain, and that this redistribution of circulatory attention produced a calming effect on the nervous system. The bath should be taken about an hour before bed, not immediately before, to allow time for the body to cool slightly. A warm body, it was held, was not conducive to sleep, which required a slight cooling of the brain. The practical challenge of a warm bath in most 19th century households, which required water to be heated on the kitchen range, carried upstairs in buckets, and poured into a portable tin bath which then had to be emptied and stored, limited this remedy's accessibility. But for those who could manage it, it was widely reported to be effective. Other physical remedies for insomnia recommended in the Victorian period included the taking of a short, gentle walk before bed, not vigorous exercise, which would stimulate rather than calm, but a slow, quiet movement through the evening air, long enough to tire the body slightly and to calm the mind with the simple, rhythmic action of walking. This was a common recommendation for insomniacs of the educated class, who were presumed to spend most of their days in mental rather than physical labor, and to need the physical aspect of the walk as a corrective balance. The application of cold water to the neck and the back of the head, a practice recommended for insomnia associated with an overheated or overactive brain, based on the theory that cooling the blood supply to the brain would slow its activity and allow the transition to sleep. This was accomplished using a cold, wet cloth applied to the back of the neck as the sleeper settled into bed, which was allowed to dry naturally through the night. The drinking of warm milk, which has a history as a sleep aid that extends far beyond the 19th century and persists to the present day. The Victorian understanding of why warm milk helped sleep: it warmed the stomach, it soothed the nervous system, it was associated from childhood with comfort and security, is not entirely supported by modern biochemistry, but is not entirely wrong either. Milk contains tryptophan, a precursor to serotonin and melatonin, and the warm temperature does have a mild sedative effect. And then there were the drugs. The 19th century had access to a pharmacopoeia of sleep-inducing substances, and some of them were used with an ease and casualness that, viewed from our contemporary perspective on addiction and drug safety, is simultaneously understandable and alarming. Laudanum was perhaps the most widely used. It was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and it was available without prescription throughout most of the century from any chemist's shop, often at low enough prices to be accessible even to working-class households. It was taken in small doses, 10 to 20 drops in water or brandy, as a sleep aid, as a pain reliever, as a calmer of nervous agitation, and as a treatment for almost anything that involved discomfort or distress. Its effectiveness as a sleep aid was not in question. It worked quickly and reliably. Its potential for addiction and its serious risks in overdose were understood by some physicians but not communicated with anything like the force that the situation warranted. Laudanum was given to adults who couldn't sleep. It was given to children, including very young children, including infants, who cried at night. There were commercially available preparations sold specifically for soothing teething babies and fretful children, with names like Godfrey's Cordial or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, which were essentially mild preparations of opium or morphine in a sweet liquid carrier. Parents administered them routinely, without awareness of the risk, and the medical profession of the early and middle parts of the century, whatever its misgivings about the practice in principle, did not do much to prevent it. By the later decades of the century, as the problems of opium addiction became more widely recognized, and as the moral panic about the opium habit gathered force, the practice of giving children laudanum became socially unacceptable, and the commercial preparations were reformulated or withdrawn. But for much of the century, the chemist's shelf of sleep aids was a frankly opiate-based enterprise, and thousands of Victorians, probably many more than the historical record can easily count, found their way to sleep each night with the assistance of a small brown bottle. Less dramatic but still notable was the use of alcohol as a sleep aid. Warm ale, mulled wine, a tot of brandy and hot water, all were widely recommended and widely practiced as bedtime preparations. The Victorian physician who recommended a glass of warm porter before bed was not being eccentric. He was drawing on a tradition of alcohol as a relaxant and sleep promoter that was centuries old and was grounded in observation that was, in its immediate effects, accurate. Alcohol does help people fall asleep. It is not helpful to the quality or the maintenance of sleep, but the initial soporific effect was real and recognized, and in the absence of modern understanding of sleep architecture, the distinction between falling asleep and sleeping well was not clearly drawn. Hops were also recommended, not in the form of beer, but as a medicinal preparation. Hop pillows, pillows stuffed with dried hops, were a popular folk remedy for insomnia that was also endorsed by some physicians, and their use extended well into the 19th century. The theory behind them has some biochemical basis. Hops do contain compounds with mild sedative properties, and there is modest evidence that proximity to their scent may have a calming effect. Whether the hop pillow was primarily pharmacological or primarily psychological, it was widely used and widely reported to be helpful. And then there was the entirely non-pharmacological approach that a significant minority of insomniacs found most reliable: getting out of bed. This might seem counterintuitive in a culture that sets such store by regular sleep habits and the proper management of bedtime. But the Victorian understanding of insomnia included the recognition that lying in bed wakeful and frustrated was not the best response to sleeplessness. Physicians recommended that those who could not sleep after a reasonable interval should rise, put on a warm robe, and occupy themselves with some quiet, undemanding activity until they felt sleepy again, a practice that modern sleep science calls stimulus control therapy and considers one of the most effective behavioral treatments for insomnia. What quiet activity the Victorian insomniac pursued in the middle of the night depended on the person. Some read, some wrote letters. Some knelt and prayed at length, which was both spiritually appropriate and practically soporific, since the sustained physical posture of kneeling in the cold, combined with the quiet, repetitive verbal activity of extended prayer, had a genuine tendency to induce drowsiness. Some made their way to the kitchen and warmed milk, or sat by whatever embers remained in the parlor fireplace. And some simply sat in the dark, in the strange interior landscape of a house at 3 a.m, and thought their thoughts. There is something in the Victorian record that we do not often acknowledge when we think about the experience of sleeplessness in that era, the experience of quiet. A sleepless Victorian in the small hours of the morning lived in a silence that is not available to us. Not just the silence of an absence of noise, but the silence of a world in which nothing was happening that required attention. No device glowing, no information arriving, no ambient connectivity. Just the house and the dark and the slow rhythm of time passing. Writers of the period who wrote honestly about their experience of insomnia, and several did, in diaries and letters and essays that were not intended for publication and are therefore particularly candid, often described the experience not only as suffering, but as a kind of strange intimacy. The middle of the night in the 19th century was genuinely another world. It was the world that existed when the social world was absent, when the demands of work and family and reputation fell away, when you were left with nothing but yourself and the dark and the slow ticking of the hall clock. Some people dreaded this world. Some people found it unexpectedly revelatory. Children and sleep, the nursery, the nurse, and the long training toward rest. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, in the upstairs rooms of those same Victorian households, a different sleep story was being written every night. The nursery. In a middle-class Victorian household with children, the nursery was a world unto itself, as distinct from the adult world of the house as a foreign country. It occupied the upper floor, or the upper rooms, and it was governed entirely by its own set of rules, rhythms, and authorities. The ultimate authority in the nursery was not the father, who might spend only a formal hour there each afternoon, and not even the mother, who was present more often but whose role in the nursery was supervisory rather than hands-on in most households of this kind. The real authority in the nursery was the nurse. The nurse, the nursemaid, the nanny, the wet nurse in the infant's case, was one of the central figures of Victorian middle-class domestic life, and she wielded over the children in her care an influence that was comprehensive, continuous, and in many cases more emotionally significant than that of either parent. She was the person who was there when the children woke up and there when they went to sleep. She was the person who managed every aspect of their daily physical existence, from the morning washing to the evening bedtime ritual to the middle of the night comfort when a bad dream struck. The sleep arrangements in the Victorian nursery were different from anything most modern parents would recognize, and they reflected a very different understanding of what children needed and what childhood sleep should look like. In the wealthiest households, the nursery was a suite of rooms, a day nursery where the children played and ate during the day, and a night nursery where they slept. The night nursery was typically arranged with a row of small beds, one for each child, or perhaps 2 younger children sharing, along with a bed or a cot for the nursemaid, who slept in the room with her charges through the night, available to tend to them if they woke. This arrangement, in which a servant slept alongside the children she cared for, was completely normal and unremarkable in the Victorian context, however strange it might appear to us. The beds in the night nursery were simple iron framed in later decades, wooden framed in earlier ones, with a straw or horsehair mattress, a bolster pillow, and several wool blankets. Iron beds, which became increasingly popular from the 1840s onward, were favored for children's beds specifically because they were easy to clean and did not harbor the bedbugs that were a persistent and deeply unpleasant feature of wooden-framed beds. The bedbug problem was a real one, and it was a greater concern in the nursery than in the adult bedroom, both because children's beds were used more continuously and because children were considered more vulnerable to the bites and the resulting sleeplessness. The bedtime routine in the Victorian nursery was highly regulated, and the household manuals and childcare guides of the period, there was a large and growing literature of childcare advice throughout the century, were very specific about how it should be conducted. Bedtime for young children was early by modern standards, typically between 6 and 7 o'clock for children under 5, between 7 and 8 for slightly older children. The idea that children should stay up until 9 or 10 o'clock, as is now common in many households, would have been considered a serious failure of child management in the Victorian period. Sleep was held to be essential for the growing child, not just for rest but for physical development, for the consolidation of the day's learning, for the proper functioning of the digestive system, and for the formation of the orderly habits that would serve the child throughout life. A child who was allowed to stay up late was being done a disservice, and a nursemaid or a mother who permitted this was failing in one of her most fundamental duties. The actual process of getting the children to bed was a ritual of considerable complexity. It began with the bath. Children's bathing in the Victorian period was more regular than adult bathing. Daily bathing for children was widely recommended by the mid-century, and in households where the infrastructure permitted it, it was practiced. The children's bath was drawn in a portable tin tub, the same kind used by adults, which was brought to the nursery and filled with warm water. The water had to be the right temperature, not too hot, a danger to the delicate skin, not too cold, a shock to the system. Testing the bath water with the elbow rather than the hand was the recommended method, a piece of practical wisdom that persists to the present day in advice to parents of young children. The bath was brief and efficient. This was not a long, luxurious soak, but a thorough cleaning, conducted with soap and a flannel cloth, attended by the nursemaid who washed the children in order of age, the younger ones first. After the bath, the children were toweled dry with the particular vigorous efficiency of people who knew that a cold child was a difficult child, dressed in their nightclothes, and had their hair attended to. For girls, hair combing at bedtime was both a grooming necessity and, in theory, a pleasure, the nursemaid combing out the tangles of the day with a wide-toothed comb, then plaiting or braiding the hair loosely for the night. In practice, the tangling of children's hair during a day of active play could make this a fraught operation, and nursery life was punctuated by the sounds of combs meeting knots and children protesting the encounter. For boys, the hair question was simpler. Short hair required only a brief combing, but there were other preparations. In the early part of the century, when children wore elaborate clothing with many fastenings and buttons and layers, the undressing process itself could be lengthy. By mid-century, as children's clothing became somewhat simpler, a modest improvement, though Victorian children were still very thoroughly clothed by modern standards, the bedtime undressing was a more manageable operation. Once in their nightclothes, the children said their prayers. Children's bedtime prayers in the Victorian period were a genre unto themselves, and they were taken very seriously. The prayer said at bedtime was often the first prayer a young child learned, and its content was specifically adapted to the anxieties and the spiritual needs of a small person confronting the mystery of sleep. The most famous of English children's bedtime prayers, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep," was not originally a Victorian prayer. It dates to the 18th century, but was in widespread use throughout the 19th century and appears in nursery records, diaries, and memoirs with the frequency of something genuinely universal. The line about praying to die before waking, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," sounds alarming to modern ears, and there is a historical debate about whether Victorian children were harmed or helped by this early introduction to the possibility of death during sleep. But in the context of the 19th century, where child mortality was high and where death was a part of family life in a way that it has largely ceased to be in the developed world, the prayer was not understood as terrifying. It was understood as honest and as a comfort. If the worst should happen, you were in good hands. It was the same logic that undergirded the adult evening prayer, the same surrender to providence that the 19th century used as its primary psychological defense against the uncertainties of the night. After prayers, the children were put into their beds. The beds were made with a precision that the nursemaid took seriously, the sheet tucked in tightly at the sides, the blankets smoothed, the pillow placed at the correct angle. Victorian children's beds were made very tight, with the bedding tucked firmly around and sometimes under the child in the manner of swaddling. Modern sleep advice would be concerned about this, both for safety reasons and because of the restrictiveness of the tight tuck. But in the 19th century, the tightly made bed was held to provide a sense of security and containment that helped the child settle. The nursemaid would then sit in the nursery while the children fell asleep, or more often would be attending to other duties in the room, mending clothes or preparing for the next morning, visible to the children and available but not actively engaging with them. The lamp in the nursery was usually kept burning at a low level, or a small nightlight, a tiny candle in a glass container, was left burning while the children settled. The Victorian night nursery was not plunged into complete darkness in the way that an adult bedroom might be. The nursemaid's presence and the small light were accommodations to the reality that children found the dark frightening. Fear of the dark, in children, was acknowledged and addressed by Victorian childcare writers, though the solutions offered varied considerably in their kindness and effectiveness. The stricter tradition held that fear of the dark was a weakness of character that should be corrected rather than indulged, that giving a child a nightlight was simply teaching the child to be afraid, and that the proper treatment was firm, early exposure to the dark, after which the fear would subside. The kinder tradition held that the nightlight was not indulgence but common sense, and that children frightened of the dark needed reassurance and gentle management rather than forced confrontation. In practice, most nursemaids made a pragmatic judgment based on the individual child, because the practical alternative, a terrified child waking every hour, made their own night considerably more difficult. Nightlights were widely used in nurseries, whatever the theoretical position of the household's parents, and the business of managing children's sleep fears was one of the constant practical challenges of nursery life. There were, of course, stories. The storytelling tradition at bedtime, the story told to a child as they settled toward sleep, is ancient, and the 19th century both continued this tradition and formalized it in the new genre of children's literature that was developing rapidly throughout the century. By the 1860s and 1870s, children's books were being written specifically for reading aloud at bedtime. Gentle, quiet stories with simple language and soothing rhythms, designed to ease a child toward sleep rather than stimulate them away from it. Before the age of widely available children's books, the stories were the nursemaid's own folk tales, songs, rhymes, and the particular kind of rambling, gentle improvised narrative that adults produce when they are trying to keep a child's attention just enough to prevent distress while gently steering it towards sleep. Any parent today who has told a story to a drowsy child, watching the sentences get longer and the child's eyes get heavier, will recognize this as a skill as old as parenthood itself. The night in the Victorian nursery could be long. Children woke from bad dreams, from cold, from illness, from teething, from the simple animal need for reassurance that does not change across the centuries. The nursemaid, sleeping lightly in her cot in the same room, or in some cases in the adjoining room with the door ajar, would wake with the children and attend to them, replacing a fallen blanket, offering a small drink of water, speaking quietly in the dark until the child settled again. The sounds of the night nursery, the soft breathing of sleeping children, the occasional murmur of a nurse attending to a waking child, the small sounds of the house settling around them, are sounds that have been lost from most modern homes. The Victorian nursery was populated at night in a way that modern children's rooms are not, by the presence of another person sleeping alongside them, and the sounds of that cohabitation were the sounds that many Victorians associated with safety in childhood and the most fundamental security of the night. And somewhere below the nursery floor in the adult world of the house, the parents were in their own bedroom, their preparations complete, their candles extinguished, their prayers said. Listening perhaps to the sounds of the house above them, registering in the particular background awareness that parents maintain even in sleep, the sounds from the nursery that were normal and the sounds that were not. The Victorian family at night was, in its way, as connected across the dark as it was in the daylight hours. The darkness did not separate them. It simply changed the nature of the connection, from the visible and verbal to the quiet, half-conscious, listening kind. Who slept where the economics and social architecture of 19th century sleep we have been spending our time, so far in a household of a particular kind. A respectable, middling household, with servants and a nursery and a parlor fire and enough money to be comfortable without being rich. But the 19th century was a vast and varied world, and sleep looked very different depending on where you lived, what you earned, and who you were. Let us step out of the comfortable parlor and walk slowly through some of the other places where people slept in the 19th century. We begin with the wealthy. In the great country houses of the English aristocracy, the houses with 40 bedrooms and a staff of 30 servants and grounds that could swallow the entire village nearby, sleep was managed on a scale and with a degree of comfort that was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any era. The bedrooms of such houses were themselves the size of ordinary houses. The four poster beds were of carved mahogany or oak, their curtains of silk or heavy damask, hung from gilded posts by silk tasseled cords. The mattresses were of the finest materials, multiple layers, the topmost of the finest goose down, changed and turned by housemaids on a strict rotation that ensured they remained even and comfortable. The bed linens were of the best Egyptian or Irish linen, ironed to a smoothness that is difficult to imagine without having felt it, the particular quality of heavily starched, expertly ironed fine linen, which lies against the skin with a cool smoothness that lasts exactly as long as it takes the body to warm it, and which is one of the most reliably described pleasures of aristocratic housekeeping. In these great houses, the bedroom was served by a dedicated staff. A lady's maid and a valet attended to the personal preparations of the mistress and master respectively. The fires, for in grand houses, the bedroom fire was not a luxury, but a standard, were laid and lit by housemaids who came in before the family was awake, moving quietly, with the practiced discretion of people trained to be invisible. Hot water was brought to the room in copper cans, still steaming, and poured into the porcelain basin on the elaborate marble-topped washstand. The curtains were drawn back in sequence, the inner curtains first, then the outer, to let in the morning light at a pace calibrated to give the sleeper time to adjust. The bath in a great house was a more elaborate affair than in the middle-class household. The private bath, a fixed tub of plumbed in hot and cold water, in a dedicated bathroom adjacent to the bedroom, was one of the markers of the truly wealthy home, and it appeared earlier in grand houses than in ordinary ones. By the mid-century, many aristocratic and upper-class households had installed bathrooms of considerable elegance, deep tubs of enameled iron or of more exotic materials like marble, with polished brass taps, tiled walls, heated towel rails. The luxury of a hot bath available on demand, without the need to heat water on a range and carry it upstairs in cans, was the kind of luxury that, once experienced, made everything else feel like inconvenience. But we must also walk in the other direction, away from the country house, away from the comfortable middle-class villa, and into the places where most people in the 19th century actually spent their nights. The worker's cottage, the lodging house, the tenement, the slum. In a worker's cottage in an English mill town, say in Manchester or Leeds or Bradford, the sleeping arrangements were determined not by preference but by the hard arithmetic of space and poverty. A cottage might have two rooms, a downstairs room that served as kitchen, sitting room, and all-purpose living space, and an upstairs room, a single room, under the roof that served as the bedroom for the entire family. The entire family, a family of 5, 6, 7, 8 people. Parents and children, and perhaps a lodger who paid a weekly sum for the right to share the sleeping space. All of them in that single upstairs room, which was perhaps 12 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling that sloped down on one side where the roof met it, and a single small window. The beds in such a room were not the elaborate, multi-layered affairs of the middle-class household. There might be one real bed, a proper frame with a mattress, for the parents, and a straw-filled mattress or a pile of blankets on the floor for the children. Or the entire family might share the one bed, a practice that was common enough in the working class to be documented by social investigators and criticized by middle-class observers who found it both morally suspect and medically dangerous. The medical concern about whole family co-sleeping was, in the context of Victorian disease knowledge, not entirely unreasonable. Tuberculosis, which was the great killer of the 19th century, responsible for roughly 1 in 4 deaths in England at certain points in the century, was a disease spread by close contact and shared air. The family that slept together in a small, poorly ventilated room, breathing each other's exhalations through the night, was a family at elevated risk of tuberculosis transmission. Reformers and public health workers understood this, even if they did not understand the mechanism, and the campaigns for improved working-class housing that were a feature of Victorian social reform were partly motivated by the recognized connection between overcrowded sleeping arrangements and disease. But the working-class family sleeping together was not simply making the best of a bad situation. It was also doing something that made practical and human sense. The shared warmth was real and important, fuel was expensive, and a family sleeping together in one bed stayed warm in a way that individual sleeping would not have achieved at the fuel budget available to them. The closeness was not only a result of poverty, but also in many cases, a preferred arrangement, an extension of the day's intimacy into the night. The notion that people had an innate preference for private, separate sleeping is, in many ways, a middle-class assumption projected backward onto the experience of people whose lives and values were arranged quite differently. The lodging house was another world again. In the cities of 19th century Britain and America, and particularly in the areas surrounding train stations, docks, and commercial centers, the common lodging house was one of the primary sleep solutions available to working men and women who were not established enough in any one place to maintain a permanent residence. These houses took in lodgers by the night or the week, providing a bed, or in the cheapest houses, a shared bed or a space on a bench, or even a rope stretched across a room on which you could hang your arms and doze upright, and sometimes a meal. The quality of common lodging houses varied enormously. At the better end were respectable houses, where working men could get a clean bed in a shared room for a few pence a night. The sheets were changed weekly, the rules against drunkenness were enforced, and the keeper of the house maintained a minimal standard of order and cleanliness. At the lower end were the houses that social investigators of the period described with the particular combination of horror and determination that characterizes the great Victorian social journalism. Crowded, filthy, stinking of the accumulated sweat and breath of many bodies, with beds occupied in shifts by different lodgers, the morning man climbing into the still warm space left by the night man, the single room housing 15 or 20 people in various states of sleep and wakefulness. Henry Mayhew, whose London Labour and the London Poor is one of the great documents of Victorian social life, visited and described many such houses in the 1850s and left accounts that are vivid and deeply uncomfortable to read. He wrote of rooms where the lodgers were of every kind, men and women, old and young, the clearly criminal and the clearly merely poor, lying together in a space that offered no privacy, no warmth except the accumulated body heat of the group, and no comfort beyond the brute fact of horizontal rest after a long day on the streets. And below even the lodging house, at the very bottom of the hierarchy of 19th century sleep, were those who had no access even to a bench or a shared bed. The people who slept in doorways, in the arches under bridges, in hay piled in stables, in the warm laundries and bakeries, where a charitable operator might turn a blind eye to the figures huddled near the heat source through the night. The 19th century city was full of people sleeping in improvised and dangerous ways. The populations of the great industrial cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, New York, Philadelphia, had grown with a speed that outran the capacity of housing provision, and the result was a housing crisis of considerable severity that expressed itself, among other ways, in the sleep lives of the urban poor. Parliamentary investigations into the conditions of the poor produced report after report in which witnesses described their sleeping conditions, with a matter-of-factness that makes the conditions sound almost normal, because for them they were. A woman in a court in Seven Dials in London, asked by an investigator about her sleeping arrangements, described a room occupied by herself, her husband, 4 children, and 3 paying lodgers, with the children sleeping on the floor. She described this as a good room because it was dry. And yet, in these overcrowded rooms and cold lodging houses and improvised street-level shelters, people still slept. The body's need for sleep is not negotiable, and it cannot be denied indefinitely. People found ways. They slept in fragments, they slept in noise, they slept crowded together, they slept on hard surfaces in strange positions, and when they woke, they went on with their lives. The resilience of the sleeping body, its ability to find rest even in conditions that seem to preclude it, is one of the more astonishing facts about 19th century working-class life. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of this world, across the Atlantic, in the new and growing cities of America, a different set of sleep arrangements was taking shape. American middle-class life in the 19th century followed the English model in many respects. The same household manuals, many of them, were read on both sides of the Atlantic, and the general principles of respectable Victorian domestic life were portable. But America had its own particular sleep customs, shaped by a different climate, a different landscape, and a different history. The American farmhouse, particularly in the rural Midwest and South, had its own sleep culture, less stratified by class and more determined by the specific demands of agricultural life. On a working farm, sleep was governed almost entirely by the rhythms of labor. You went to sleep when the work was done and the livestock were settled, and you got up when the work needed starting, before dawn, often, in seasons of pressing activity. There was no leisure class on the working farm, no genteel drawing room wind down, no nurse managing the children's bedtime routine. The farm family went to bed together and got up together, pulled along by the same work schedule, sharing the same exhaustion and the same early morning imperative. The farmhouse bedroom in America could be a comfortable place. The quilts made by farm wives are one of the genuine art forms of the period, functional and beautiful, the product of collective effort and individual creativity, or it could be spare and cold. The frame house of the prairie, particularly in the years of early settlement before prosperity had time to establish itself, could be genuinely harsh. Thin walls, drafty windows, a stove that went cold in the night, and a landscape outside that in winter was completely inimical to human comfort. The covered wagon, for those who made the westward migration, presented sleep challenges that were simply extreme. A covered wagon offered shelter from rain and wind, but not from cold, and sleeping in a wagon, in a space roughly the size of a large bathtub, potentially shared with several other people and with provisions packed around them, required a pragmatic approach to comfort. Pioneers who left accounts of their travels described sleeping in whatever clothing they could pile on, wrapped in every blanket and quilt available, sometimes with children nested between adults for warmth. The quality of sleep under such conditions was, by any measure, poor. The necessity of sleep was absolute. And so the 19th century, across its vast geography and its equally vast social range, contained multitudes of sleepers in all conditions, making do with what they had, finding rest where they could, and carrying on. The medicine of sleep doctors, theories, and the Victorian science of rest, and as the night deepens, let us turn our attention to the people whose professional responsibility was the management of sleep, the doctors of the 19th century, and the remarkable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes completely wrong body of theory they built up around the human experience of rest. The 19th century was the century in which medicine became a science. It did not start that way at the beginning of the period. Medicine was still largely a matter of tradition, apprenticeship, and theoretical frameworks inherited from ancient authorities. But by the end of the century, the foundations of modern medical science were in place. Germ theory, anesthesia, antisepsis, the beginnings of pharmacology, the development of the stethoscope and the thermometer as diagnostic tools, the organization of medicine into specialties, the establishment of medical education on a proper scientific basis. All of this happened during the 19th century, and it transformed the relationship between physicians and their patients. But in the area of sleep, the transformation was slower and more uneven than in other areas of medicine. Sleep was difficult to study scientifically. It was invisible, internal, subjective. You could not see a person sleeping and know what was happening inside them. You could not measure the brain's activity during sleep. The technology for that would not arrive until the 20th century, with the development of the electroencephalogram. You could only listen to what people said about their sleep, observe the effects of sleep deprivation or disturbance, and theorize they did. The dominant understanding of sleep in the early 19th century was essentially hydraulic. Sleep was understood as a state in which the vital forces, the nervous energy, the blood, the animal spirits, retreated from the surface of the body and from the active organs of perception and thought toward the interior, the brain, the heart, the digestive system. In sleep, the blood flowed inward. The brain, deprived of its outward-directed activity, fell into repose. The senses, no longer bombarded by external stimuli, closed down. Waking was the reversal of this process, the vital forces returning outward, the brain reactivating, the senses opening again. This model, which owed much to ancient humoral theory and to the physiological thinking of the Enlightenment, was coherent in its own terms, even if it bore little relationship to what we now know about the neuroscience of sleep. It made predictions that seemed to be borne out by observation. People did feel a withdrawing, a cooling, a slowing as sleep approached. The warm blood rushing to the periphery when one was excited or afraid did seem to contrast with the cool inwardness of deep sleep. The model told a story that made sense, even if it was the wrong story. Medical writers derived practical recommendations from this model. If sleep was a process of vital force retreat, then anything that promoted such retreat was sleep promoting, and anything that impeded it was sleep disrupting. Warmth of the extremities, which encouraged the blood to move outward from the core, was good for sleep, hence the use of bed warmers and warm baths. Mental excitement, which drew the vital forces to the brain and kept them active there, was bad for sleep, hence the recommendation against intellectual work in the evenings. Stimulating foods and drinks, which kept the digestive system in active work, drew vital forces to the stomach and away from the reposeful interior, hence the recommendation for light suppers. By mid-century, the hydraulic model was being challenged and refined by the new physiology, which was beginning to identify the nervous system as the key mechanism in sleep rather than the blood. The physician and scientist William Carpenter, whose principles of human physiology went through many editions in the mid-Victorian period, described sleep in terms of the nervous system's activity and the gradual withdrawal of cerebral function as exhaustion accumulated through the day. Sleep, in this view, was the nervous system's necessary period of recuperation, the time during which the accumulated products of waking activity were cleared away and the tissue was restored for the next day's demands. This is, in broad outline, actually quite close to the modern understanding of sleep's function, and it is worth noting that Victorian physicians arrived at this general picture through a combination of careful clinical observation and theoretical inference that was, given the limited tools available to them, genuinely impressive. What they lacked was the ability to observe the brain during sleep, to measure neurotransmitter activity, to distinguish between the different stages of sleep that EEG technology would eventually reveal. but the general principle, sleep as restoration, as necessary biological maintenance, was grasped. The management of sleep disorders was, naturally, approached through the lens of these theories. Insomnia, understood as a failure of the nervous system to achieve its necessary repose, was treated by addressing the presumed causes of that failure. An overactive brain needed to be calmed by the removal of stimuli. A disordered digestive system needed to be settled by attention to diet. A troubled conscience needed to be quieted by prayer and the resolution of moral conflicts. The physician's toolkit for sleep disorders was modest by modern standards, but not entirely ineffective. Beyond the behavioral and moral recommendations already discussed, there were pharmacological options. Bromide of potassium, potassium bromide, was widely used as a sedative from the 1860s onward. It was prescribed for insomnia, for epilepsy, for what was called nervous agitation, and for a variety of other conditions. Its sedative properties were genuine, and it remained in use until the early 20th century. Its problems, accumulation in the body with long-term use, producing a toxic state called bromism, were not immediately recognized, and many patients were given doses that over time produced serious side effects. Chloral hydrate, introduced in the 1860s, was the first purely synthetic sleeping drug, and it was embraced by the medical profession with an enthusiasm that was, in retrospect, only partially justified. It was effective, it genuinely produced sleep and quickly, and it was initially believed to be safe, which it was in moderate doses for short-term use. Charles Dickens, in the last years of his life, used chloral hydrate to manage the insomnia that troubled him, and he was far from alone. The drug became widely prescribed and, in the hands of a careful physician, was a genuinely useful addition to the sleep medicine toolkit. Morphine, the purified and more potent relative of laudanum's opium, was increasingly available and increasingly prescribed as the century progressed, particularly after the hypodermic syringe made it possible to deliver a precise dose directly into the bloodstream. Morphine for insomnia was prescribed more cautiously than laudanum had been, because by mid-century the addictive properties of opiates were better understood, but it was still prescribed, still used, still quietly necessary for the relief of serious, chronic sleeplessness. And then there was the whole world of self-medication, the remedies available without prescription at any pharmacy or general store, the patent medicines with their reassuring names and their unexamined ingredients. The variety of sleep aids available over the counter in the Victorian period was considerable, and their contents were largely opaque to the people who purchased them. Hops, valerian, and other herbal ingredients with mild sedative properties were combined with alcohol, and sometimes with opium in preparations sold under cheerful, homely names. The purchaser knew only that the bottle on the shelf had helped their neighbor sleep, and that was sufficient. The question of when to call a doctor for sleeplessness was itself a class-inflected one. Middle-class families, who could afford the fee for a medical consultation, were more likely to seek professional advice for persistent insomnia. Working-class families, for whom a doctor's visit represented a significant expense as well as a loss of work time, were more likely to rely on self-medication and folk remedies, consulting the chemist, pharmacist, rather than the physician, and making do with whatever the chemist recommended. The chemist was in many ways the primary medical resource for the working and lower middle classes throughout most of the century, particularly in urban areas. The chemist's shop, with its large glass vessels of colored liquid in the window, its shelves of bottles and packets, its smell of camphor and soap, and something astringent and medicinal, was the place where most people went with their minor ailments, including sleeplessness. The chemist was expected to have a remedy for most common complaints, and for insomnia, the recommendation was typically one of the mild patent medicines, or a preparation the chemist made up themselves from standard ingredients. The doctor then was someone you consulted for serious or persistent problems, and the advice they gave for sleep disorders reflected the broader medical thinking of the era. Rest, physical rest, not just sleep, was frequently prescribed for conditions associated with nervous exhaustion. The rest cure that became fashionable in the later decades of the century, associated particularly with the American physician Silas Weir Mitchell, prescribed complete bed rest, weeks or months of lying still, eating and doing nothing, as a treatment for neurasthenia, which was the period's preferred diagnosis for a cluster of symptoms including fatigue, depression, anxiety, and sleeplessness. The rest cure was prescribing sleep as medicine in its most literal form. The patients of the rest cure were, disproportionately, middle-class women, and this is not incidental. The Victorian understanding of women's health and women's sleep was shaped by specific assumptions about the female nervous system that both reflected and reinforced the social constraints of the period. Women were held to have more delicate nervous systems than men, more susceptible to stimulation, more vulnerable to the consequences of overexcitement, requiring more rest and more protection from the demands of the active world. The prescription of rest, of literally lying down and doing nothing, for educated, energetic, intelligent women who were frustrated by the constraints of their lives was, as feminist historians have pointed out, not an accident. It was the medical system's way of managing women whose restlessness threatened the social order. But we are getting into contested territory, and the night is not the time for controversy. Let us pull back from the doctor's consulting room, from the patent medicine cabinet, from the theoretical debates about nervous systems and vital forces, and return to the bedroom. The quiet bedroom, at whatever time of night it is, with whatever the state of the sleeper's health, and whatever their social position. Let us just listen to the house. The clock in the hallway below strikes the hour. It is a warm, measured sound, the sort of sound that has been present in this house for longer than the current residents can remember. The clock strikes 3, or 4, or 2. The hour is indeterminate. It hardly matters. What matters is that the house is quiet, and the people in it are, for the most part, sleeping. Bathing and the sleeping body, the 19th century relationship between cleanliness and rest there, is something that the 19th century body carried to bed that we do not, and it is worth acknowledging quietly, without judgment, the residue of the day. Our own relationship with cleanliness before sleep is so thoroughly shaped by the assumption of daily bathing that we rarely question it. We shower, most of us, either in the morning or in the evening or both, as a matter of daily routine so normalized that it does not feel like a choice. But the daily bath, the full body immersion in water that we now take for granted, was, for almost the entire 19th century, neither universal nor particularly recommended. And understanding what took the bath's place, and why, tells us something important about the sleeping body and its social meaning in the period. Full body bathing in the early 19th century was relatively infrequent for most people. Among the poor, it might occur only a handful of times a year, when conditions permitted. Among the middle class, it might be weekly or fortnightly, or whenever the household routine and the availability of hot water made it feasible. Among the wealthy who had staff to heat and carry water, and who had, by mid-century, often installed actual bathrooms, it might be more regular. What took the place of the full bath was what was called the sponge bath or the basin wash, a thorough washing of the face, neck, hands, and the most essential parts of the body, performed at the washstand with a basin of water, a cloth, and soap. This was the morning ritual in most respectable households, performed upon rising, and it was considered adequate to the demands of cleanliness for most ordinary days. The washstand, in its ubiquity in the Victorian bedroom, reflects the centrality of this practice to daily life. The morality of cleanliness in the Victorian period was complex and layered. On one level, cleanliness was straightforwardly a social virtue. A clean person was a respectable person, a person who had control over themselves and their circumstances, a person who understood and met the obligations of civil society. On another level, cleanliness was a moral signal in a much deeper sense, bound up with the evangelical Protestant values that shaped so much of Victorian social life. Cleanliness was godliness, and the clean body was an emblem of the clean soul. But this moral valuation of cleanliness existed in tension with a medical tradition that was actually rather suspicious of frequent washing, particularly in cold water. The concern, and it was a persistent one, expressed in medical texts throughout the early and middle parts of the century, was that frequent washing weakened the natural resistance of the skin. The skin was understood to have a protective function, and that function was partly physical. It kept external agents out, and partly something more like moral. It maintained the body's boundaries against contamination. Washing too often was believed to remove the natural oils and protective substances of the skin, leaving it more vulnerable to cold, to drafts, to disease. This anti-bathing medical conservatism is not as foolish as it might initially appear. The skin does have a natural microbiome, a community of beneficial organisms that live on its surface and play a role in its health, and the aggressive use of soap, particularly the harsh lye soaps of the period, did disrupt this microbiome. The recommended practice of washing with cold water as a tonic for the constitution, cold water bathing as a health measure, associated with the hydropathy movement of the mid-century, had its own complex medical rationale, and the bracing quality of cold water was genuinely felt as invigorating by those who practiced it. The hydropathy movement, water cure, as it was sometimes called, was one of the more interesting medical fashions of the mid-Victorian period. Its proponents, following the lead of a Silesian farmer named Vincenz Priesnitz, who developed the practice in the 1820s and 1830s, advocated comprehensive treatment with water, cold baths, wet sheet wraps, drinking large quantities of water, and sweating. Water cure establishments, hydropathic hotels, opened across Britain and America in the 1840s and 1850s, offering treatments for everything from rheumatism to nervous exhaustion. Darwin himself was among the patients of water cure establishments, finding some relief from his chronic health problems in the cold plunge baths and the rigorous regimen of the spa. Tennyson visited many prominent Victorians who were troubled by ill health, and there were many, the 19th century being not gentle on the bodies of its inhabitants, tried the water cure at some point, and a fair number reported genuine benefit, though the benefit probably had as much to do with the rest, the regular routine, the good food, and the removal from the stresses of ordinary life as with the cold water itself. For our purposes, the question of sleep, the water cure establishments offer an interesting perspective on how 19th century thinkers understood the relationship between bathing and rest. At a hydropathic hotel, the day was organized around therapeutic water applications, and sleep was considered one of the key outcomes being promoted. The combination of physical treatment, regulated diet, fresh air, these establishments were often in rural or seaside locations, and the removal of the patient from their ordinary environment was explicitly designed to restore the capacity for natural, restorative sleep. The hydropathic physician understood that most of their patients were people whose sleep had been disturbed by the pressures and the miasmas of city life, and that the treatment was partly a matter of creating conditions in which the body could remember how to rest. This is a recognizable idea, the therapeutic retreat, the deliberate removal of the insomniac from their normal environment, the installation of a regular and calming routine as a prerequisite for sleep. It appears in Victorian hydropathy, and it would appear a century later in modern sleep clinics, and the underlying logic is not so different. The relationship between bathing and the bedtime preparation, between the clean body and the ability to sleep, was understood differently by different people in the period. The middle-class household that managed weekly baths, the washstand ablutions in the morning, and perhaps a foot bath in the evening, had established a cleanliness routine calibrated to the available technology and the prevailing medical opinion. The wealthy household with a bathroom took baths on what approached a daily basis, and the connection between the evening bath and good sleep was noted explicitly in the household management literature of the later decades. The connection between a clean body and a comfortable bed was also a class marker of considerable significance. Clean linen, clean nightclothes, clean bed sheets was associated with a standard of living that required not only the money to buy linen, but the domestic organization to wash, dry, iron, and store it on a regular schedule. The ability to get into clean sheets at the end of the day was a material comfort of a very specific kind, the kind that people who have it barely notice, and people who lack it feel as a constant, low-grade insult to their dignity. The laundry, in a Victorian household, was a major operation. Monday was usually laundry day. The washing that had accumulated over the week was gathered, sorted, soaked, boiled, scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and hung to dry in a process that occupied most of the day and required considerable labor, either from the housewife herself or from the laundry maid or from a washerwoman brought in for the purpose. The bed linens, the sheets, the pillowcases, the nightclothes were washed and returned to service on a regular rotation that kept them reasonably clean without replacing them more often than necessary. The sheets on a Victorian bed were changed approximately weekly in a well-managed middle-class household. This is more frequently than in many earlier periods, but less frequently than the daily sheet change that some people practice today. Weekly changing of the sheets was considered the minimum standard for respectability, and anything less was noted, in domestic management writing, as a sign of insufficient housekeeping. The smell of clean sheets, dried in the open air, dried on a line in the garden or in the yard, dried by the sun and the wind, is one of those sensory details of 19th century life that appears again and again in the memoirs and diaries of the period, always with a quality of warmth and satisfaction. The particular smell of sun-dried linen, which is genuinely different from machine-dried linen, was the smell of sleeping well. It was associated with order, with cleanliness, with the proper management of domestic life, and the smell of a body after a day's work, a worker's body in particular, was something else. The 19th century city was a place of smells that we simply cannot replicate because the smells were the product of technologies and conditions that no longer exist. Coal smoke, horse manure, tanneries, gas lamps, the specific smell of large numbers of people living in close quarters without daily bathing. These were the background smells of Victorian urban life, and they were present in the bedroom as much as anywhere else. People were not unaware of this. The literature of social investigation is full of passages about smell, the investigator who enters a working-class lodging house and is struck by the quality of the air, the density of the human smell, the closeness. The inhabitants of such rooms had habituated to these smells, as people always habituate to the conditions of their own lives, and they did not find them a barrier to sleep. The body falls asleep regardless of its smell. and the wealthy Victorian who did have access to regular bathing and to clean sheets and to the kind of domestic management that kept the bedroom fresh and the nightclothes laundered. That person lay down in an environment that was, by the standards of the day, deeply comfortable. The clean, slightly cold sheets, the smell of lavender sachets placed in the linen press, the particular quality of a well-made bed in a well-managed house, orderly, generous, prepared. These are the things that the Victorian housewife or the housekeeper organized with such care, and they are the things that made the bed a sanctuary, not merely a place to sleep, but a place constructed with deliberate attention to the conditions of comfort. Servants and the night, the people who kept the house going while everyone slept, and as the night deepens further, let us consider the people who made it possible for others to sleep comfortably, the servants of the 19th century household, whose own sleep was fitted into the gaps left by the management of everyone else's. The servant in a Victorian household was not, in most cases, a person of remarkable circumstances. They were ordinary young men and women, mostly women from the working class or the lower middle class, who had found employment in service because it offered room, board, and a wage, however modest, in a period when the alternatives for young women with limited education were few. Domestic service was the largest single occupation for women in England throughout the 19th century, employing at various points between 1.5 and 2 million people. This is a number worth pausing on. 1 in 3 single women in mid-Victorian England was in domestic service. The Victorian household, with its staff of servants, was not an elite institution. It was, above a certain income threshold, the universal condition. The servants' relationship to sleep in the Victorian household was shaped, above all, by the structure of their day. A domestic servant, particularly in a household that was not overstaffed, worked long hours. The first duties of the morning began before the family was awake, perhaps at 6 o'clock, perhaps earlier, particularly in the case of the kitchen staff who needed time to lay and light the fires, heat water, begin preparations for breakfast. The last duties of the evening, clearing up after dinner, making sure the fires were banked, completing whatever mending or preparation had been assigned for the following day, might not be finished until 10 or 11 at night. Between the early morning start and the late evening finish, the servant's day was largely filled with continuous work. There was a period in the afternoon, perhaps an hour or two, that was designated as free time, but even this was conditional on the work being done and the family not requiring anything. In households with a small staff, which was most households, a servant might spend this afternoon free time doing her mending, because there was simply no other time for it. The servant's bedroom, her room, as it was called, was typically at the top of the house, in the attic under the roof. The servant's attic room was usually small, usually cold, usually poorly furnished, and usually shared. In larger households, the maids might sleep 2 or 3 to a room. In smaller households, there might be a single servant in a single room just large enough for a bed, a small dresser, and a chair. The bed in the servant's room was not the elaborate, multi-layered affair of the family's bedrooms. It was simple, a wooden or iron frame, a mattress, a bolster, perhaps 2 blankets. The sheets were laundered, but the standard of comfort was several grades below what was provided in the family rooms, and this was accepted as entirely appropriate by both parties to the arrangement. The servant's room was furnished to a standard that reflected the servant's position in the household hierarchy. Adequate, clean if the household was well managed, but without the small luxuries, the good lamp, the soft rug, the extra blanket that made the family's bedrooms comfortable. The servant's sleep, like every other aspect of the servant's life, was managed and monitored. In most Victorian households, there were rules about what time servants were expected to be in their rooms at night, and violation of these rules was grounds for dismissal. The concept of followers, young men who came to visit the female servants, was a constant preoccupation of householders, and rules against allowing followers into the house were standard in most households' employment terms. The fear, partly moral, the impropriety of unchaperoned young people, and partly practical, the distraction and disruption that followers could introduce into the household's routine, led to a level of surveillance of the servant's personal life that we would now find extraordinary. The housemaid who was expected to be in her room by 10 o'clock and who was expected to be up and working at 6 was getting 8 hours of potential sleep, which sounds adequate, except that the quality of that sleep was often compromised by the conditions of the room, by the accumulated physical exhaustion of a very demanding day, and by the background anxiety of her situation. The awareness that her employment, her room, her food, and her entire material security depended on the good opinion of her employers, who were the same people whose every need and comfort she spent her days serving. The relationship between the servant and the family in the context of sleep was also, sometimes, strangely intimate. The servant who slept in the nursery was, as we have already noted, present throughout the night alongside the children in her care. The housemaid who rose at 6 to light the fires was entering the family's bedrooms before the family was awake, building the fire in the grate as quietly as possible, removing the chamber pot, placing the hot water for the morning wash, all while the family slept or dozed a few feet away. The lady's maid who helped her mistress dress and undress each day, who brushed her hair and helped her into and out of her nightclothes, had a degree of physical intimacy with her employer that was entirely at odds with the strict social distance maintained in every other aspect of the relationship. This intimacy was managed by convention. The servant simply did not acknowledge what she saw or heard in the process of doing her job. The family's morning state, disheveled, sleepy, before the elaborate social presentation of the day had been constructed, was a secret the servant kept as part of the tacit agreement underlying the entire relationship. The servant knew things about the family's bodies, their habits, their nighttime movements that no one outside the household knew, and she carried this knowledge with the professional discretion that was the first requirement of her position. The cook's relationship to sleep was shaped by the particular tyranny of kitchen hours. The cook was almost invariably the first person in the house to rise and the last to stop working, and the physical demands of her work, hours of standing at a hot range, lifting heavy pots, managing fires, produced a particular kind of bone-deep exhaustion at the end of the day. The cook's sleep in this context was not a luxury but a physiological necessity, and the cook who did not get enough of it, who was kept working too late, who was woken too early, who was given a room with a bad mattress or a room that was too cold to sleep comfortably, was a cook who would, over time, decline in health and in the quality of her work. Good householders understood this in a practical sense, even if the language of their understanding was not the language of worker welfare. The butler in a grand household had a somewhat different relationship to the night. The butler's duties included the security of the house. He was the last person to make rounds before the household retired, checking the locks, extinguishing any lights that had been left burning, ensuring the silverware was secured. In very large households, he might also oversee a night watchman, an additional staff member whose sole job was to walk the house and grounds through the night, a practice inherited from an earlier era when fire and burglary were constant concerns. The night watchman in the grand household is a figure worth pausing on. He walked his rounds through the darkened house, carrying a lantern, checking the rooms, listening at the windows. He knew the house at night in a way that no one else did, the particular quality of its silence, the sounds it made as it cooled and settled, the way light from the moon moved through the windows and shifted as the hours passed. He was the guardian of the sleeping household, and his presence was the guarantee that the family could surrender to sleep without fear. This pattern of nocturnal watchfulness, one person staying awake so that others could sleep safely, is ancient, and it reflects something fundamental about the social organization of sleep. Sleeping is vulnerable. A sleeping person cannot defend themselves, cannot respond to threat, cannot exercise the continuous vigilance that waking life requires. The safety of sleep has always required someone or something to stand watch, and in the 19th century household, this function was filled by a combination of architectural features: locks, bolts, shutters, practical measures, banked fires, checked windows, and in some cases, an actual person whose job was to remain awake and vigilant through the hours of darkness. Dreaming in the 19th century, what Victorians thought dreams meant, and why the dreamer lies in the dark. The body is still, the breathing slow, the face, let us say, turned slightly toward the window, where the faintest line of light might be beginning to show or not. The house is quiet. The clock has not struck for some time, and inside the sleeper's mind, something is happening that is not sleep exactly and not waking exactly, but a third thing, the dream. Dreams were a matter of intense interest in the 19th century, and the interest was of a very different character from our own. We live after Freud, which means that we live after the revolution in dream interpretation that proposed the unconscious as a real thing, and dreams as its coded messages, requiring interpretation by a trained specialist. The Victorian relationship to dreams was more various, less systematized, and in some ways more immediate than our own. In the religious framework that shaped most Victorian life, dreams were first and foremost a potential avenue of divine communication. The Old Testament was full of significant dreams: Joseph's dreams in Egypt, Pharaoh's dream of the fat and thin cattle, Daniel's interpretations, the dreams of prophets and kings. The New Testament had its own, Joseph of Nazareth, directed by an angel in a dream to take Mary as his wife. The early Christian tradition had grappled extensively with the question of which dreams were divine in origin and which were demonic, and the general answer, that God could speak through dreams, but so could the devil, and that distinguishing between the two required great care, cast a shadow of interpretive uncertainty over the dream experience that persisted into the 19th century. Most ordinary Victorian Christians did not look to their dreams for divine messages. The direct revelatory dream was something associated with the biblical past, with the especial holiness of saints, or with the ecstatic experiences of evangelical revival, not with the ordinary morning after recollection of having dreamed that the cat had got into the pantry, but the background awareness that dreams might be significant, that they were not merely random noise from a sleeping mind, remained. People noted their dreams, discussed them with their families, occasionally recorded them in diaries. The medical understanding of dreams in the 19th century was, like so much else, in transition. The early Victorian medical view held that dreams were essentially the product of the body's physical state during sleep, specifically, the state of the digestive system. Indigestion and uncomfortable dreams were firmly associated in medical thinking, and the nature of the dream was held to be influenced by the content and the digestibility of the last meal. A heavy, indigestible supper produced disturbing dreams. A light, properly digested one produced, if any dreams, tranquil and pleasant ones. This belief was not without observational basis. The experience of waking from a dream of suffocation or pursuit, and realizing that one has been sleeping in an uncomfortable position, cutting off circulation, breathing into the pillow, lying on the chest, is sufficiently common that the body's physical state clearly does influence the content of dreams. And the period's limited understanding of digestion and its relationship to sleep meant that the connection between heavy eating and bad dreams, which is real if not quite in the way the Victorians understood it, seemed like an obvious causation rather than a correlation. By mid-century, as physiological understanding improved, and as the nervous system began to replace the digestive system as the primary framework for understanding bodily processes, the medical understanding of dreams shifted. Dreams came to be understood as the activity of a partially awakened nervous system, the brain continuing to process the impressions of the day even in sleep, with insufficient control to organize them into the coherent narrative of waking thought. This explanation, dreams as imperfectly processed experience, had something in common with modern neuroscience's understanding of memory consolidation during sleep, though it lacked the sophistication of modern accounts. The literary relationship to dreams in the 19th century was rich and complex. The great Romantic tradition, which held that the imagination in its most unconstrained state, as in dreams and in poetic vision, had access to truths that rational waking consciousness could not reach, gave dreams a particular prestige in literary culture. Coleridge had written that Kubla Khan came to him in an opium-assisted dream. De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater described, in elaborate and often beautiful prose, the extraordinary dream landscapes produced by opium, and the book was widely read and widely influential. The dream as source of artistic inspiration, the dream as the mind's most authentic self-expression, the dream as gateway to something beyond ordinary experience. All of these ideas were in active circulation in 19th century literary culture. The Gothic literary tradition, which was enormously popular throughout the century, was saturated with dreams. The ghost story, the tale of supernatural horror, the novel of psychological terror, all made extensive use of the dream as a narrative device. Dreams in Gothic fiction were prophetic, warning the dreamer of horrors to come. Dreams revealed hidden truths. Dreams were the channel through which the dead communicated with the living, through which past crimes reached out to trouble the present, through which the unconscious life of the character manifested itself in images of terror or revelation. Mary Shelley, in her preface to Frankenstein, described the dream vision that inspired the novel, the image that came to her in the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep, of a student of unhallowed arts bending over the creature he had assembled from charnel houses. Whether the account is literally true or a literary convention, it expresses something real about the relationship between the half-woken mind and creative vision that many writers and artists of the century recognized in their own experience. The popular culture of dream interpretation, the dream book, the dictionary of dream meanings that could be consulted the morning after, was also a feature of Victorian life, particularly among the less educated and the more superstitious. Dream books had existed for centuries, and they continued to be printed and sold throughout the 19th century, even as the educated classes increasingly dismissed them as superstition. The dream book offered ready-made interpretations. To dream of water meant fortune or journey or emotion, depending on the book. To dream of teeth falling out meant illness or loss. To dream of flying meant ambition or freedom. These interpretations drew on a mixture of folk tradition, classical symbolism, and the simple human need to make meaningful what had been, in the night, vivid and strange. The nightmare, the bad dream, the dream that woke you gasping and disoriented in the dark of your cold bedroom, had its own cultural history in the 19th century, and the word itself carries the echo of an older belief. The mare of nightmare was originally a kind of supernatural creature, a spirit, a demon, a hag, that was believed to sit on the chest of the sleeper, and produce the sensation of crushing weight and paralysis that we now understand as sleep paralysis, a phenomenon that occurs when the brain wakes partially from REM sleep, while the body remains in the paralysis state that normally prevents us from acting out our dreams. Sleep paralysis, the experience of being awake but unable to move, sometimes accompanied by vivid hallucinations of a presence in the room, was a common experience and was interpreted within the cultural frameworks available to the experiencer. For a rural English person in the early 19th century, the explanation was the nightmare hag, or some local equivalent. For an educated Victorian of the mid-century, it was a physiological anomaly, a malfunction of the nervous system's transition between states. For someone with strong religious beliefs, it might be an experience of demonic visitation. The same physical experience, interpreted through three different frameworks, producing three completely different emotional and psychological responses. The experience of the hypnagogic state, the transition between waking and sleep, in which the brain begins to produce dream-like images and sounds, while the sleeper is still partially conscious, was also noted and described by Victorian writers and thinkers. The visual patterns that appear on the inside of the closed eyelids as sleep approaches, the voices and words that seem to be heard from nowhere, the sensation of falling that jolts the sleeper back to wakefulness. All of these were part of the recognized phenomenology of sleep in the 19th century, part of the nightly theater of the mind that every person who had ever lain awake long enough to watch themselves fall asleep knew, even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe it precisely. The French astronomer and writer Camille Flammarion wrote at length about hypnagogic phenomena in the late 19th century, describing the images and sounds of the sleep threshold with the careful attention of a scientist observing a natural phenomenon. His accounts have a quality of wonder that is genuinely moving, a man watching his own mind enter sleep, trying to hold the moment of transition in his attention long enough to record it, knowing that the very effort of attention might delay or prevent the thing he was trying to observe. In the quiet of the Victorian night, then, the dreamer was not simply an inert body moving through meaningless neural noise. They were a person whose culture gave their dreams potential significance, divine or demonic or creative or diagnostic, depending on which cultural framework they inhabited, and whose mind was doing something that was recognized, if not fully understood, as a real activity, a real engagement with a real inner world. The dream was taken seriously. The nightmare was feared, and the fear was culturally sanctioned, because the nightmare was understood not merely as an unpleasant experience, but as a possible sign of something wrong with the body, something wrong with the soul, something coming. In the morning, around the breakfast table, dreams were discussed. This is documented in diaries and letters, with a frequency that suggests it was a normal social activity, not every morning, not in every household, but regularly enough to be a recognizable part of domestic life. "I had the strangest dream," the husband would say, and the wife would listen, and someone would offer an interpretation, and the dream would be held for a moment in the ordinary daylight of the breakfast room before dispersing, as dreams do, back into the indeterminate territory from which it came. Sleep on the move trains, ships, stagecoaches, and the art of sleeping in transit. There is another kind of 19th century sleep that is quite different from the bedroom sleep we have been considering, and it deserves its own chapter, its own careful attention, because it reveals something about how people adapted their sleep habits to the demands of a rapidly changing world. The 19th century was the century of transport transformation. In 1800, the fastest way to travel overland was on horseback, and the most comfortable way was in a well-sprung carriage. By 1900, the steam railway had created a network of transit that connected cities across continents. Transatlantic steamships had reduced the crossing from weeks to days, and the experience of distance had been permanently altered. And along with the experience of distance, the experience of sleep in transit had been transformed in ways that tell us a great deal about how people thought about rest, comfort, and the claims of the body on a journey. Let us begin with the stagecoach, because the stagecoach is where the 19th century begins, at least in terms of long-distance land travel. The stagecoach journey in the early 19th century was an experience of considerable discomfort. The coach was suspended on leather straps, which reduced but did not eliminate the jolting of the road. The roads themselves, even the turnpike roads that represented the best of English road building before the railways, were rough by modern standards, full of ruts and potholes that sent shocks through the vehicle at every yard. The interior of the coach was cramped, a space designed for 4 or 6 passengers, in which those 6 passengers sat pressed together for hours and potentially days at a stretch, their knees touching, their shoulders in contact, their faces uncomfortably close to the faces of strangers. Sleep in a stagecoach was possible but not comfortable. The passengers leaned against each other, propped themselves in corners, rested their heads on the padded sides of the interior when the jolting permitted. The famous image of the stagecoach traveler asleep with their head lolling on their neighbor's shoulder is not merely comic. It reflects the reality that long-distance travel involved long hours, and that the body's need for sleep could not be entirely suspended for the duration of a 2-day journey. Night coaches that traveled through the night, time to arrive in the morning and depart again in the afternoon, were common on major routes, and the experience of a night journey in a stagecoach was one that many 19th century writers recorded with a mixture of tolerance and complaint. The combination of motion, cold, cramped quarters, and the difficulty of finding a comfortable position made genuine sleep elusive. What people got typically was a shallow, intermittent half-sleep, the drowsy semi-consciousness of a tired person who cannot quite relax into full sleep, punctuated by jolts, by stops at coaching inns to change horses, by the sounds of the other passengers, and by the cold that seeped through the coach windows even when the leather curtains were drawn. At the coaching inns where the coaches stopped, travelers had the opportunity for proper sleep if the schedule permitted. The coaching inn was one of the great institutions of pre-railway England, and its bedrooms were a critical infrastructure, a network of sleeping rooms that made long-distance travel by road possible. The quality of coaching inn accommodation varied enormously. At the best inns, the famous establishments on major routes between London and the provincial cities, the rooms were genuinely comfortable. A proper bed, a fire if the traveler was willing to pay extra, a supper and a breakfast, clean if not luxurious linen. At the worst, a traveler might find themselves in a shared room with strangers, on a bed whose sheets had seen several previous occupants without washing, with the sounds of the yard, the horses, the stablemen, the arriving and departing coaches, providing a continuous accompaniment through the night. The railway changed everything. When the railway arrived, and it arrived at different times in different places, but by the 1840s, it was well established across most of England and beginning to spread across America and Europe, the nature of long-distance travel was transformed in a way that made earlier transport look like prehistory. The railway was faster, cheaper, more reliable, and by the standards of the time, vastly more comfortable than anything that had come before. But the railway also created new challenges around sleep, and the response to those challenges tells us a great deal about Victorian values and Victorian ingenuity. The earliest railway carriages were not designed for sleep. They were designed for sitting in increasingly differentiated classes of comfort: first class with upholstered seats, second class with wooden benches, third class with nothing at all in the very early years, or benches in open carriages that left the passenger exposed to the smoke and sparks of the locomotive. None of this was conducive to sleep, and for short journeys it did not need to be. But as railways extended to longer routes, as it became possible to travel from London to Edinburgh, from New York to Chicago, from Paris to Vienna, the question of how passengers were to sleep on an overnight journey became pressing. And the answer, developed first in America and then adopted in Europe, was the sleeping car. The Pullman sleeping car, named for George Pullman, who developed it in America in the 1860s, was one of the genuine innovations in the history of travel comfort. The Pullman car was a railway carriage fitted with fold-down berths, sleeping berths, that could accommodate passengers lying full length during the night. In the daytime, the berths folded up to become seating. At night, they were let down and made up with sheets and blankets, providing a reasonable facsimile of a bed, albeit a narrow one, in a moving train. The Pullman car had attendants, black men in America, following the specific and troubling racial history of Pullman service in that country, where freed slaves found employment as Pullman porters in a position that was simultaneously prestigious relative to other available work and marked by the particular deference and servitude that the role required. These attendants made up the berths, provided linens, carried shoes for polishing, brought refreshments, and generally managed the sleeping passengers through the night with the same combination of service and discretion that characterized domestic service in Victorian households. The parallel is not accidental. The sleeping car was essentially a domestic space transported onto a railway carriage, and the codes of service that governed it were the same codes that governed the household. In England, first-class sleeping accommodation on railways developed slightly differently. Private sleeping compartments, a single compartment for one or two travelers, with a fold-down bed, were available on overnight express trains from the 1870s onward, and they represented a reasonable level of comfort for those who could afford them. The sheets were clean, the berth was tolerably wide, and the steady rhythmic motion of the train, combined with the darkness of the compartment and the white noise of the wheels on the rails, was actually conducive to sleep for many travelers. There is something specific and lovely about the sound of a train at night, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels over the rail joints, the sway and rock of the carriage, the occasional whistle in the dark. Many people find it soporific, and this observation is old enough to appear in 19th century writing with the frequency of a recognized phenomenon. The train, in its motion and its sound, mimics some of the qualities of being rocked, the gentle, rhythmic, repetitive motion that soothes infants, and it turns out, continues to have a calming effect on the adult nervous system. Sleeping on a night train was, for many people who managed to do it, a surprisingly satisfactory experience. The sea voyage presented different challenges. Transatlantic travel in the early 19th century was a matter of weeks aboard a sailing vessel, entirely subject to the weather, capable of being dramatically prolonged by unfavorable winds, and capable of being dramatically unpleasant by a combination of rough seas, inadequate provision, and the simple misery of being in a small space in constant motion for an extended period. Sleep at sea in this context was difficult because the ship's motion was constant and unpredictable, because the sounds were constant and varied, the creaking of the timber, the working of the rigging, the movement of water against the hull, and because the cabin accommodations of most vessels were cramped and not particularly comfortable. The development of the steamship changed sea travel much as the railway had changed land travel. Crossing times decreased dramatically, from weeks to days for the Atlantic, and the design of passenger accommodations improved significantly as the steamship companies competed for the custom of an expanding traveling public. By the 1870s and 1880s, the great ocean liners were providing first-class accommodation of genuine luxury, staterooms that approached the comfort of a good hotel room, dining rooms of considerable elegance, amenities designed to make the passenger forget, as much as possible, that they were at sea. For the traveler in first class, sleeping on a steamship in the later Victorian period was quite manageable. The ship was large enough to dampen the worst of the ocean's motion. The stateroom had a proper fixed berth, and the lulling combination of the ship's vibration and the sound of the sea against the hull was, for many travelers, actually pleasant. Those prone to seasickness, and many people had a more difficult time, and the remedies available to them were limited. Fresh air on deck, a recumbent position, various folk remedies of doubtful efficacy. For the emigrant in steerage, the person making the crossing in the cheapest possible accommodation, which was the accommodation chosen by the millions who left Europe for America throughout the century, the experience was altogether different. Steerage was a space below the waterline or just above it, crowded with hundreds of people in shared bunks, inadequately ventilated, prone to flooding in bad weather, and subject to the concentrated smell of many people in a small space without washing facilities. The crossings that the emigrant ships made, some of them weeks long, in the pre-steam era, or days long in the steam era but still cramped and unpleasant, tested the human capacity for adaptation to its limits. The immigrant who eventually set foot on the dock at New York or Boston or Quebec, after days or weeks in steerage, had developed a relationship with sleep and the absence of sleep that was the product of a specific and very demanding experience. They had learned to sleep in noise, in motion, in discomfort, amid strangers. They had learned to take rest in whatever form the moment offered, because the alternative, remaining continuously awake for the duration of the crossing, was simply not possible. This capacity for adaptive sleeping, sleeping in difficult conditions out of sheer biological necessity, is another constant in the 19th century experience of sleep, one that we have largely lost the need to exercise. We sleep, most of us, in fixed places at fixed times, and we expect the conditions of our sleep to be reasonably consistent. The 19th century traveler, whether immigrant or tourist, had a more flexible and in some ways more robust relationship with sleep, not because they were tougher, but because the conditions of travel demanded it. And through all of this transit, through the swaying stagecoach, the rhythmic railway car, the rolling ship, the body continued to seek its rest, to find the gaps in the wakefulness and fill them with sleep, however fragmentary, however uncomfortable. The body's need for sleep is not a luxury or a preference. It is a biological imperative, and it asserts itself regardless of circumstance, finding its way toward rest even when rest is the last thing the environment seems to offer. The morality of sleep, what sleeping too much, or too little, said about your character. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, there is a conversation happening about sleep that we have not yet fully entered. It is happening in the pulpits, in the conduct books, in the pages of improving literature, in the diaries of the earnestly religious, and it is a conversation about what your relationship with sleep says about your moral character. The Victorian era was in one of its most characteristic aspects an age of moral earnestness. This was not peculiar to Britain. The same earnestness was present in Protestant America, in Protestant Northern Europe, but it was particularly intense, particularly articulate, and particularly documented in the English-speaking Victorian world. The Victorians wrote about morality constantly. They wrote conduct books and improving novels and sermons and essays and letters of advice to their children and memoirs of self-examination. They took the moral life seriously in a way that, to a 21st century reader, can seem both admirable and exhausting. Sleep in this moral universe was not innocent. It was a charged activity, a site of potential virtue or vice, a behavior that could be done rightly or wrongly, and the right or wrong of it reflected on the character of the sleeper. The primary moral concern about sleep was excess. Too much sleep, sleeping longer than the body strictly required, lying abed when one should be up and working, was understood as a form of sloth, and sloth was one of the 7 deadly sins. The Victorian Household Manual, the Improving Tract, the Sermon of the Evangelical Preacher, all of them were in agreement that the person who lay in bed past a reasonable hour was indulging a weakness of the will that had spiritual as well as practical consequences. The habit of rising early was not merely practical advice, it was a moral imperative. The body of writing recommending early rising in the Victorian period is extraordinary in its volume and its vehemence. Samuel Smiles, Whose Self-Help, published in 1859, was one of the best-selling books of the Victorian era, devoted considerable space to the virtue of early rising, associating it explicitly with the qualities he most admired: industry, self-discipline, the capacity for sustained effort that distinguished the self-made man from the idler. The great men of history, in Smiles's account, were without exception early risers. Napoleon slept only 4 hours. Franklin rose at 5. The implied lesson was unmistakable. If you wanted to achieve great things, you had first to get out of bed. The female equivalent of the early rising virtue was the household management literature that praised the mistress who was up before her servants, who had overseen the morning fires and the breakfast preparations before the cook had finished setting the kitchen to rights. The ideal housewife of the Victorian domestic manual was never found asleep at 8 in the morning. She was up, she was dressed, she was managing, she was present. Her early rising was evidence not just of her diligence, but of her moral seriousness, her understanding that the household required governance, and that governance required the governor to be awake. The habit of lying abed, of reading or dozing in bed in the morning past the time when duty called, was associated with a whole cluster of moral and physical problems. It was self-indulgent. It produced weakness of constitution. It trained the will in the wrong direction, accustoming the sleeper to the prioritization of comfort over obligation. It led, in the improving literature's standard causal chain, to other and greater moral failings. The person who could not leave their bed on time could not be expected to punctuate their affairs, or to honor their commitments, or to resist other temptations of ease and comfort. There is a particular 19th century character who appears again and again in the literature, in the novel, in the improving tract, in the sermon, as a cautionary figure: the person who sleeps too much. He is, and it is usually a he, which reflects the specific anxieties about male productivity in a commercial, competitive age, a man of abilities who never fulfills his potential because he cannot get out of bed. He is talented but lazy, clever but undisciplined, full of good intentions that dissolve every morning in the warm comfort of lying in just a little longer. He is the figure against whom the productive Victorian pitted himself, and the contest between the self-disciplined early riser and the self-indulgent late sleeper was one of the era's organizing narratives of moral striving. But the moral concern about sleep was not only about excess, it was also about insufficiency. The person who did not sleep enough, who worked past midnight, who driven by ambition or anxiety sacrificed their necessary rest on the altar of productivity, was also a figure of concern in Victorian moral and medical writing, though the concern had a slightly different character. Working too hard was a morally respectable failure. It was, in some ways, a failure that Victorian culture had created and encouraged. The emphasis on industry, on self-improvement, on the accumulation of merit through sustained effort produced people who drove themselves without mercy. And the medical writing of the period increasingly recognized that this driving produced illness, nervous exhaustion, breakdown, the condition called neurasthenia, in which the overworked individual simply ran out of the vital force that sustained active life and collapsed into incapacity. The prescription, as we have noted, was rest. But the moral complexity of recommending rest to a person who was failing from overwork in a culture that valued work was considerable. The patient who was told to rest was, in a sense, being told to do the thing that had been most consistently condemned. The physician had to negotiate between the moral imperative to work and the physiological imperative to rest, and often did so by framing rest as a form of practical wisdom, not sloth, but strategic recuperation in the service of continued productive life. The diary in the Victorian period was one of the primary instruments of moral self-examination, and sleep appears in Victorian diaries as a subject of genuine self-scrutiny. People recorded what time they had gone to bed and what time they had risen. They noted whether they had slept well or badly. They commented on the quality of their rest and its effect on the following day's work. They expressed guilt when they had slept in, satisfaction when they had risen early, anxiety when sleeplessness left them unfit for the day's duties. The diary entry that reads, "Rose late, did not get to my work until 10, feel ashamed," is not uncommon in Victorian personal documents, and it reflects the degree to which sleep behavior was understood as a moral matter requiring record reflection, and when necessary, repentance. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who lived just before the Victorian period proper, but whose influence on Victorian Protestant culture was enormous, kept meticulous records of his sleep throughout his long life, noting with satisfaction the nights when he rose at 4 or 5 for morning prayer and study, and recording with concern the occasions when sleep overtook him. Wesley's approach to sleep was explicitly disciplinary. He believed that the natural tendency of the flesh toward comfort and rest needed to be countered by an act of will, and that the act of rising early and submitting the body's desire for sleep to the mind's and spirit's authority was a form of daily spiritual exercise. This Wesleyan approach to sleep, disciplined, watchful, suspicious of the body's preferences, was one strand in the complicated Victorian moral understanding of rest. Another strand was more generous, the understanding that the body had legitimate needs, that God had created sleep as a gift and a necessity, that the refusal of appropriate rest was not virtue, but a kind of ingratitude toward the Creator. This more generous view was present in Victorian spiritual writing too, and it softened the harshness of the purely disciplinary approach without entirely displacing it. The result of these competing moral discourses about sleep was a characteristic Victorian ambivalence, an alternation between guilt about sleeping too much and guilt about not resting enough, between the imperative to rise early and work hard, and the recognition that the driven, sleepless life was self-destructive and perhaps arrogant. Most thoughtful Victorians lived somewhere in the tension between these poles, and it is a tension, interestingly, that is not entirely foreign to many people in the contemporary world. The sickroom sleep, illness, and the long watches of Victorian nursing, and as the night deepens once more, let us enter a room we have been approaching for some time, the sickroom. In the 19th century, illness happened at home. Not always, not without exception, there were hospitals, and they were used particularly by the poor who had no home to be sick in, or by those requiring surgical intervention. But for the general run of illness in a household of any means, the patient was nursed at home, in their own bed, by their own family, with whatever professional assistance the physician could provide on his visits. The sickroom was, in many Victorian households, a fixture of domestic life. The 19th century was not short of illness. Tuberculosis was endemic. Scarlet fever, typhoid, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, these were the diseases of childhood and adulthood alike, visiting households without warning, sometimes taking a single member, sometimes working through an entire family. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, the infection that killed mothers after childbirth, was a constant presence in the experiences of Victorian women and their families. And the ordinary illnesses, the long winter coughs, the recurring migraines, the chronic digestive complaints, kept people in their beds for days and weeks at intervals throughout a life. The management of the sickroom was therefore one of the central domestic skills of the period, and it was treated as such in the household management literature. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management included an extensive section on the management of the sick, covering the arrangement of the room, the preparation of invalid food, the management of the patient's sleep, and the duties of the nurse. Florence Nightingale's Notes on Nursing, though specifically addressed to nurses rather than housewives, was widely read by both and was treated as an authoritative guide to the practice of sickroom management. Sleep was central to the Victorian understanding of recovery. The body healed during sleep. This was a recognized principle in the medical thinking of the period, and it was right. Sleep was protective, restorative, essential to the recovery from illness. The patient who was sleeping well was understood to be progressing. The patient who could not sleep was understood to be in difficulty. And the management of the sick person's sleep, the creation of conditions in which sleep was possible, the protection of sleep once achieved, the gentle promotion of sleep when it was elusive, was one of the primary duties of the nurse. Florence Nightingale wrote about this with characteristic passion. Her insistence on the importance of nursing patients back to sleep after nighttime disturbances, her fury at the practice of waking patients unnecessarily to take medications or to perform medical checks, her recognition that the quality of sleep was as important as any other indicator of the patient's condition. All of this reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between sleep and health that was ahead of her time. Nightingale's practical recommendations for promoting sleep in the sickroom were sensible and largely consistent with modern understanding. Fresh air, a ventilated room not sealed against the night. Quiet, the nurse should move with great care and should prevent any unnecessary noise in the vicinity of the patient's room. Darkness, sufficient to promote sleep, though not so complete as to cause disorientation if the patient woke. Warmth but not stuffiness. The bed should be warm enough to be comfortable, but the room should not be so hot as to be oppressive. And regularity, the patient's mealtimes, medication times, and care routines should be organized to minimize nighttime disturbance as far as possible. The problem of nighttime nursing, of maintaining the constant attendance that a seriously ill patient might require through the long hours of the night, was one that the Victorian family solved through a combination of family labor and hired help. In a household with a seriously ill member, the family would organize a watch schedule. Family members would take turns sitting up with the patient through the night, one relieving another at intervals of perhaps 2 or 4 hours, so that someone was always present, but no one was deprived of all sleep. The role of night watcher was taken seriously and was considered an act of love and family duty, to sit beside a sick person through the small hours, to monitor their breathing and their temperature, to provide a drink of water or a spoonful of medicine when needed, to hold a hand if they woke frightened in the dark. The night watcher sat in the sick room in whatever light was permitted, a small nightlight on the mantelpiece, or the dying embers of a carefully managed fire, and waited. The waiting had its own quality, different from ordinary waking, different from sleep, a suspended state of alert attention in which the watcher was aware of every sound from the bed, every change in breathing, every movement, every word spoken in delirium or in sudden wakefulness. Delirium was a feature of many 19th century illnesses, particularly the high fevers of typhoid, scarlet fever, and pneumonia. The delirious patient, speaking strange words, seeing things that were not there, moving with purposeless energy toward some imagined need, required a different quality of attendance from the simply sleeping patient. Keeping a delirious patient in bed, keeping them from harm, managing the terrifying spectacle of a person who was present but absent, speaking but not there. This was one of the most distressing experiences of Victorian domestic life, and it was experienced by most families sooner or later. The hired nurse, a professional sick nurse, distinct from the wet nurse who nursed infants, was a figure of considerable importance in Victorian domestic life, and her relationship to sleep was particularly fraught. The professional nurse was hired specifically for the nighttime work that wore out family members quickest: the sitting up, the watching, the management of the patient through the long hours of darkness. She was expected to be awake and attentive all night, and to rest during the day while family members took over. The quality and the character of professional nurses in the pre-Nightingale period was a subject of considerable complaint. The figure of Sary Gamp in Dickens's Martin Chuzzlewit, a drunken, slovenly, unreliable night nurse who drank the patient's brandy and slept when she should have been watching, was a caricature, but caricatures do not come from nothing. The reform of nursing, which Nightingale led and which transformed the profession over the second half of the century, was partly a reform of the management of sleep in the sick room. The trained nurse was expected to maintain a standard of alert and attentive care through the night that the untrained nurse, exhausted, poorly paid, and without professional pride to sustain her, could not reliably achieve. The training of nurses included explicit instruction in the management of sleep, both the nurse's own sleep and rest patterns, which needed to be managed to prevent exhaustion, and the patient's sleep, which needed to be protected and promoted as a central therapeutic priority. The experience of being ill in the 19th century and of being nursed through illness was thus intimately connected to the experience of sleep in all its forms. The medicinal sleep promoted by the skilled nurse, the restless half-sleep of fever and pain, the strange clarity of the night hours when illness strips away the ordinary preoccupations of the day and leaves the self frightened or peaceful, depending on the person and the prognosis, confronting the bare reality of its own vulnerability. Many Victorian memoirs and novels contain long, careful accounts of illness and recovery that dwell on sleep with a quality of attention that is striking. The first night of really good sleep after a long illness, the first night when the fever has broken and the body has remembered what rest feels like, appears in these accounts as one of the great experiences of ordinary life, a turning point, a mercy, a homecoming. The return to sleep after illness has taken it away is experienced with a gratitude and a relief that illuminates, by contrast, how much the healthy person takes their nightly rest for granted. Sleep and the seasons, how the 19th century night changed through the year. The night, in the 19th century, was not the same all year round. This is an obvious statement, but it points to something important: that our experience of modern life, with its electric lighting and its central heating, and its year-round access to the full range of activities regardless of the season, has largely removed from our awareness. Before electric light, and before the comprehensive domestic heating that only became normal in the 20th century, the seasons governed life in a much more direct way than they do for most people now. And they governed sleep in particular. In winter, people went to bed earlier. This was not simply a cultural preference or a habit. It was a rational response to the simple fact that the day was short, that the darkness came early, and that the cost and inconvenience of maintaining artificial light for many hours was a real consideration in most households. When the sun set at 4 in the afternoon and it was cold and dark and the fire had burned low, the practical wisdom of going to bed was compelling. There was nothing, in the literal sense, to stay up for. The winter night was therefore long, 12, 14, 16 hours of darkness in the extreme northern latitudes, and people adapted their sleep to fill it. The pattern of segmented sleep that we have already discussed, with its first sleep and second sleep and the quiet waking hours between them, was particularly adapted to long winter nights. The 14-hour winter darkness did not require 14 hours of sleep. It required instead a different relationship with the night, a willingness to be awake during some of those dark hours and to use them quietly, privately, before returning to sleep. In summer, the situation was reversed. The long summer days, with darkness not falling until 9 or 10 in the evening and dawn arriving before 5, compressed the night into a brief window. People stayed up later because the day continued to offer light and warmth and the possibility of outdoor activity until late in the evening. Farmers worked in the fields past 7, past 8, taking advantage of the long light. Children played outside until driven in by darkness, which was late. The social life of the upper classes was arranged around the long summer evenings, dinners that began late and ended later, evenings spent in the garden, moonlit gatherings that were possible only because the summer night was so much shorter and softer than the winter one. The summer bedroom was also different from the winter bedroom. The heavy curtains that in winter were drawn against the cold were pulled back or replaced with lighter ones. The windows were opened rather than sealed. The multiple layers of bedding were reduced to a sheet and perhaps a single blanket. The quality of summer sleep was, in many accounts, lighter and more easily disturbed by the early morning light, by the sounds of the summer night, by the warmth of a room that was not cold. The sounds of the summer night deserve their own moment of attention. In the countryside, and most of the 19th century population was rural, or at least lived close enough to the country to hear its sounds. The summer night was alive with sound. Birdsong began before dawn, sometimes well before dawn, in a cascade of species-specific calls that served as a reliable and thoroughly natural alarm clock. The nightingale, which was genuinely common in southern England in the 19th century and has since declined to near invisibility, sang through summer nights in a performance that was widely noted and widely loved. A liquid, bubbling, impossibly complex song that poured through open windows into dark bedrooms and was heard by generations of Victorian sleepers as one of the quintessential sounds of the English summer night. The sound of the nightingale, in Victorian poetry and in Victorian personal writing, appears consistently as a sound experienced between wakefulness and sleep, heard in the drowsy condition of a warm summer night when the mind is soft and receptive, and the distance between sleeping and waking is at its shortest. Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, written a generation before the Victorian period proper, captures something of this experience that continued to resonate throughout the century. The bird's song heard as if from another world, calling the listener toward a kind of dissolution that is half sleep and half something more. The spring and autumn brought their own specific sleep conditions. Spring was the season when the household shifted its sleep management from the cold weather configuration to the warm weather one. The heavy curtains were taken down and cleaned, the wool blankets were put away, the winter nightwear was replaced with lighter garments. This seasonal shift was itself a domestic ritual, part of the spring cleaning that was one of the major household events of the Victorian calendar. Mattresses were turned and aired in the spring sunshine. Blankets were hung on the line to beat and refresh. The feather beds were unpacked from their summer storage and checked for condition. The bedroom, subjected to this seasonal cleaning, was put to rights for the coming season of lighter sleeping. Autumn was the time of the reverse operation, the warm things retrieved, the cold weather preparations made, the house reconfigured for the darkness and cold that were coming. And there was in autumn a particular quality to the evenings that many Victorian writers noted, a closing down quality, a gathering inward, the fire lit again for the first time in months, the curtains drawn against the early dark, the sense that the house was preparing to be sealed against the world for another long season. The rhythm of sleep through the year in the 19th century was the rhythm of the natural world. People were more tired in winter, and they slept more. They were more awake in summer, and they slept less. The body's relationship to the light, which we now understand in terms of circadian rhythms and melatonin production, was, in the pre-electric world, simply expressed in the behavior of daily and seasonal life because there was nothing to override it. You could not extend the day with electric light. You could not make your body think it was noon at midnight. You went to sleep when the darkness and the cold and the depletion of the day made sleep the only reasonable response, and you woke when the light and the warmth and the sounds of the living world called you back. This is not romanticization. The winter cold was genuinely uncomfortable. The early darkness was genuinely limiting. the lack of artificial light was a real constraint on what people could do and when. But within those constraints, the body found a natural alignment with its environment, a synchrony of inner and outer rhythms that had been the universal human experience for the entirety of our species' history before the 20th century, and that is now available only to those who deliberately seek it. The American night sleep customs in 19th century America, and as the night deepens, let us cross the Atlantic. Let us leave the English countryside and the English town and step into the American night, which was both similar and genuinely different from what we have been exploring. America in the 19th century was a country of extraordinary contrasts, in climate, in economy, in culture, in the lived experience of its people. Plantation in Georgia, a whaling ship in the Pacific, a sod house on the Nebraska prairie, a boarding house in Lower Manhattan, a Cherokee settlement in the southeastern interior, a frontier mining camp in California. These were all simultaneously 19th century America, and each of them had its own sleep customs, its own relationship to the night, its own specific and distinctive way of arranging the hours of darkness. Let us begin in the East, where the 19th century American middle class was constructing its own version of the Victorian domestic ideal. New England and the mid-Atlantic states, throughout the 19th century, followed English domestic customs with the closeness appropriate to a recently English culture. The household manuals that shaped domestic life were often English ones, or were American adaptations that drew heavily on English originals. The domestic ideal of the orderly, comfortable Christian home was held as firmly in Boston and Philadelphia as in London and Manchester. The bedroom, the bedtime routine, the night clothes, the management of the fire and the lamp, all of these followed patterns very similar to what we have already described, but America added its own specific concerns to the English inheritance. The frontier was always present in American consciousness, even in the settled eastern cities, and it shaped attitudes towards sleep in ways that were partly practical and partly mythological. The frontier American, the settler, the pioneer, the farmer at the edge of the inhabited world, was held to be a different kind of person from the settled European, and part of that difference was supposed to be a tougher, more natural, less fussy relationship with sleep. The American ideal of robust, natural sleep, sleeping in the open air when necessary, doing without the elaborate preparations of the English household, rising early by simple biological imperative rather than by social custom, was articulated most powerfully by the Transcendentalists. Thoreau at Walden Pond, sleeping in his simple cabin without servants or elaborate bedding, rising early to observe the dawn, spending his nights in a direct relationship with the natural world that the over-furnished, over-carpeted Victorian bedroom was supposed to have destroyed. This was an explicit counter-image to the sleep customs of the respectable household, offered as an argument for simplicity and authenticity. Thoreau's sleep at Walden was, in practice, probably not very different from the sleep in the comfortable middle-class bedroom. He had a bed, he had blankets, the cabin was reasonably weatherproof, but the ideology was different. He was sleeping there by choice, in solidarity with a natural order that he believed the conventions of society had obscured. The choice of where and how to sleep was, for Thoreau, a moral and philosophical act, not merely a practical one. The American South had its own sleep customs, and they were shaped, ineradicably, by slavery. The institution of slavery determined the sleep lives of enslaved people in ways that were brutal and total. Enslaved people slept when and how their enslavers permitted, and the conditions of that sleep were in most cases profoundly inadequate. The quarters where enslaved workers slept, the slave cabins of the plantation system, were small, poorly built, minimally furnished, and often overcrowded. A single room might house multiple families. The bedding was minimal, a few blankets, a straw mattress if the enslaver was relatively generous, nothing more than the floor in the worst cases. The sleep of enslaved people was not protected by the night. Owners and overseers could intrude at any hour. Enslaved mothers with infants at the house, wet nurses and domestic servants, might be called from their beds at any time of the night to attend to the needs of the white household. The distinction between day and night that structured the sleep lives of free people simply did not apply in the same way to those whose entire existence was defined by their subjection to another person's will. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiographical writings, described the sleeping conditions of enslaved people with his characteristic combination of specificity and controlled anger. The cold, the inadequate covering, the lack of privacy, the way that the deprivation of proper sleep was one of the many instruments through which slavery maintained its power over the people it held. To deny a person adequate sleep is to deny them a fundamental form of restoration, and Douglass understood this clearly. The free black communities of the North, meanwhile, were working to establish the conditions of domestic comfort, including proper bedrooms and proper sleep, that were both practically desirable and politically significant. The The comfortable home, with its proper bedrooms and its proper domestic management, was an argument. It was evidence against the racist claim that Black Americans were incapable of the civilized domestic life that the period associated with full humanity. The sleep customs of prosperous free Black households in Philadelphia or Boston or New York were in this context not merely personal preferences but political statements. The American boarding house is another institution that deserves attention in any account of 19th century American sleep, because it was the primary sleep arrangement for a very large proportion of the American population that was not settled into permanent domestic arrangements. Boarding houses where a landlady or landlord provided room and board, bed and meals to paying boarders, were one of the central institutions of American urban life throughout the 19th century. Young men and women who came to the cities to work, in offices, in factories, in shops, as teachers or as seamstresses or as clerks, typically lived in boarding houses before marriage created the possibility of their own household. The boarding house was the in-between place, the transitional institution, the place where independent people who were not yet independent enough to maintain their own establishment lived their daily and nightly lives. The boarding house bedroom was shared. Almost universally, in the cheaper establishments, the bedroom was shared between 2 or more boarders, and the custom of sharing a bed with a stranger, or with a fellow boarder who was only a little less than a stranger, was accepted as a normal condition of this kind of life. Male boarders shared beds with other male boarders. Female boarders shared with female boarders. This was not understood as an intimate arrangement in the modern sense. It was simply the standard configuration of affordable accommodation in a city where space was expensive. The quality of sleep in a boarding house depended heavily on the quality of the establishment. A well-managed boarding house, with a conscientious landlady who changed the linen regularly and kept the rooms clean, provided reasonable accommodation. A proper bed, clean enough sheets, a fire in winter if the terms included it. A poorly managed one provided the opposite. A bed that had not been properly cleaned between occupants, linen that had passed through too many bodies without washing, a room shared with a stranger whose snoring, or whose late hours, or whose smell made sleep difficult. The American boarding house meal, which was included in the price of board, was one of the contexts in which the evening's social life was conducted. A table shared with fellow boarders, a period of collective eating and conversation that served as the social anchor of an otherwise atomized existence. And after dinner, the boarders retired to their shared rooms, and the particular challenge of sharing a sleeping space with relative strangers had to be navigated with whatever combination of good humor, discretion, and tolerance the individuals concerned could muster. The frontier, which advanced steadily westward through the century, generated its own sleep customs that were as varied as the conditions of frontier life itself. The settler family in a newly built sod house on the Kansas prairie slept in a space that was damp, that smelled of earth, that was close to the animals whose body heat might supplement the inadequate insulation of the walls, and that was subject to the particular sounds of the open prairie at night, sounds that, for people newly arrived from the settled East or from Europe, were completely foreign and sometimes alarming. The sounds of the American prairie night were extraordinary, and they were noticed, and they were recorded by settlers who had enough literary ability to capture them. The wind, which on the open prairie blew without the interruption of trees or hills, with a consistency and a force that settlers from wooded regions found almost incomprehensible, produced a continuous background sound that ranged from a low moan to a roar, and it was accompanied in season by the sounds of insects, of frogs in nearby water, of coyotes whose calls, floating across the dark distance, sounded to Eastern or European ears like something uncanny and alarming. Settlers adapted, as people always adapt, and the sounds of the prairie night that had seemed threatening in the first weeks became familiar, then unremarkable, then, for those who stayed long enough to become truly at home, actually reassuring, the sound of the world they belonged to. The old settler who slept through a Kansas windstorm without waking was sleeping as soundly in their element as the English farmer who slept through a Devon rain. The mining camp offered yet another variant. The California gold rush of 1849 and the subsequent silver rushes created communities of men, almost exclusively men, living in conditions of deliberate impermanence, their attention focused entirely on the extraction of wealth, their domestic arrangements reduced to the bare minimum compatible with survival and continued function. The miner's sleep was the sleep of a man who had been working physically hard all day and who needed rest as a purely functional matter. The bunk in the mining camp tent or shack was not a place of domestic comfort. It was a rest station, a recovery space between shifts of demanding labor. The bedding might be a blanket, the pillow might be a rolled coat. The room, if room it could be called, might be shared with many other men in a similar condition of exhausted pragmatism. And yet, among the chaos and the noise of the mining camp, the drunkenness, the gambling, the violence that attended the concentration of young men in a lawless environment, there were also ordinary moments of domestic impulse. Men who had lived in orderly households before the gold rush brought their household customs with them, or tried to. They made their beds with what they had. They established routines. They imposed on the improvised circumstances of camp life whatever fragments of domestic order they could manage, because domestic order, the made bed, the clean plate, the evening routine, was itself a form of sanity, a link to the self they had been before and hoped to be again. Gaslight and the changing night, how artificial light began to transform sleep in the 19th century. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, this one somewhat louder than what we have been visiting, something important was happening to the night itself. Gaslighting had arrived. The first gaslit street in London was Pall Mall, illuminated in 1807, and the change it represented was immediately recognized as something of a different order from anything that had come before. Not a candle, not an oil lamp, those were improvements in the same general direction, producing more or less of the same kind of light, but a genuinely different thing. A light that burned without a wick, that could be turned on and off with a tap, that was connected through underground pipes to a central source, that could illuminate a street or a room with a brightness and a steadiness that no individual flame had ever achieved. The spread of gas lighting through the cities of Britain was rapid. By the 1820s, central London was largely gas-lit. By the 1840s, gas had reached most major provincial cities. By the 1850s, gas had begun to enter the interiors of middle and upper-class houses as well as the streets, the gas chandelier in the dining room, the gas bracket in the hallway, the gas lamp in the parlor replacing the oil lamp and the candle. The effect on the night was significant, and it was noticed. The gaslit city at night was a genuinely new phenomenon, and people wrote about it with the same mixture of wonder and unease that tends to attend genuinely new technologies. The streets of London at midnight, lit by gas lamps that burned steadily and brightly through the hours of darkness, were streets in which activities were possible that had never before been possible, or had been possible only with great difficulty and considerable expense. Shops could stay open later. Theaters could run their performances longer. The social life of the wealthy could be extended well past the hour when, in the candlelight era, the cost and the inconvenience of maintaining adequate light would have brought it to a close. The gaslit interior of the bourgeois home was a different experience from the candlelit or oil lamp-lit interior. The light was brighter and more even. It did not flicker in the same way. There was some movement, some life to the gas flame, but it was more consistent than candle or oil. It illuminated the room more thoroughly, leaving fewer deep shadows in the corners. It made reading and needlework easier because the quality of the light was better. But the gas lamp had a cost that was not immediately apparent. It made staying up easier, more comfortable, more socially possible. And making staying up easier was, over time, a change with consequences for sleep. The history of artificial light and human sleep is, in one of its most important aspects, a history of each improvement in artificial light moving bedtime slightly later. The oil lamp, better than the candle, extended the evening. Gas, better than oil, extended it further. Electric light, better than gas, would extend it further still. Each improvement in the quality and cost of artificial light gave people a reason to remain awake a little longer, and the accumulated effect of these improvements, over the course of a century and a half, has been to shift human bedtimes by several hours. In the Victorian period, the effect of gaslighting was already being noted with some concern. The ability to stay up late, to read in good light, to entertain into the small hours, was available to those who had gas in their homes, and it was being used. The household manuals began to include warnings about the dangers of late nights, the wearing of the Constitution by continued wakefulness past the natural bedtime, the overstimulation of the nervous system by late-night reading and social engagement, the difficulty of maintaining the early rising that health required when the evening had been extended by artificial light. These warnings were accurate in their identification of the pattern, even if their medical explanations were imprecise. The extension of the social and intellectual day by means of artificial light did produce a later bedtime, and a later bedtime, in the absence of a correspondingly later rising time, which the demands of work and family and social convention prevented in most cases, produced shorter sleep. The gas lamp was, in this small and cumulative way, the beginning of the sleep deprivation that electric light would bring to a much more extreme expression. In the latter decades of the century, Thomas Edison's electric light began to appear in public spaces, and by the 1880s in the homes of the wealthy. The electric light was brighter still, safer, no combustion, no risk of gas leak, and available at the turn of a switch. Its spread was slower than gas had been, partly because the infrastructure required to deliver electric power was more complex and expensive than gas pipes, but its direction was clear. and those who observed it clearly understood that it represented the final and complete abolition of the natural relationship between darkness and sleep. A few voices in the later 19th century observed this with concern. The connection between the extension of wakefulness by artificial light and the growing complaints of insomnia, of nervous exhaustion, of the general inability to sleep that seemed to be a feature of the modern, urban, commercially driven life. This connection was drawn by some physicians and some social commentators, even if they did not have the neuroscientific framework to explain it precisely. They knew from observation that the people who could not sleep were, disproportionately, city people, people who lived in well-lit environments, people whose evenings were extended by the resources of artificial light. The countryside, where candles were still common, and where the night fell in something closer to its pre-industrial form, seemed to produce better sleepers. This perception was partly romanticization of rural life, which has its own difficulties and its own insomnia. But it was not entirely wrong. The rural person who went to bed at 8:30 in winter and woke at 5 was following a schedule more closely aligned with their biological rhythms than the urban person who stayed up until midnight reading by gaslight and was then dragged awake at 7 by the demands of professional life. The relationship between artificial light and sleep disruption is one of the most thoroughly documented in modern sleep science, and the Victorians who first noticed the pattern, however imprecisely they explained it, were identifying something real. The irony is that the gas lamp that lit the Victorian bedroom so comfortably for the bedtime reading session was also, very slightly but very consistently, eating into the sleep that the reading session was preparing for. The institutions of sleep hotels, hospitals, asylums, and prisons beyond the domestic household, the 19th century built a range of institutions in which sleep was managed, deliberately, systematically, in service of various purposes. The hotel, the hospital, the asylum, the prison, each of these was a place where people slept not in their own beds under their own control, but in beds provided and managed by an institution, according to institutional rules and rhythms. The hotel as we know it, the purpose-built, purpose-run establishment for the temporary accommodation of paying travelers, was largely a 19th century invention. The coaching inn had served this function in the pre-railway era, but it was a different kind of institution, smaller, more casual, organized around the needs of the road journey rather than the needs of the traveler per se. The railway hotel, the great hotel built adjacent to the major railway stations to serve the new traveling public that the railway had created, was something new, something that reflected the commercial ambitions and the organizational capabilities of a fully industrial society. The grand railway hotels of the Victorian era, the Midland Grand at St. Pancras Station in London, the Palmer House in Chicago, the Grosvenor in Liverpool, were monuments to the idea that sleeping away from home could be made not merely tolerable but genuinely luxurious. They offered private rooms with proper beds, dining rooms of considerable elegance, and services that managed to replicate, in a commercial setting, something of the feeling of a well-run private household. The bedroom at the Midland Grand had running water, gas lighting, and a service corridor through which the staff could reach the rooms without entering the main corridor, a piece of design intended to ensure that the guests' encounter with the logistics of their own service was as minimal as possible, preserving the illusion of comfort without effort. The hotel bedroom was, and is, a particular and somewhat peculiar experience of sleep. It is comfortable but not quite yours. The bed is good but not quite your bed. The sounds and the smells and the quality of light are those of the institution rather than the home, and even the best hotel cannot entirely eliminate the slight foreignness of the institutional environment. Victorian travelers wrote about hotel sleep with a mixture of appreciation and complaint: appreciation for the comfort, complaint for the small ways in which it failed to replicate the feeling of one's own home. The hospital was a different kind of institution altogether. The Victorian hospital, the general hospital of the period, which served primarily the poor and the working class, since those who could afford to be ill at home were ill at home, was a place where sleep was both essential and difficult to achieve. The ward system that Florence Nightingale helped to reform and rationalize provided large, airy spaces where patients slept in rows of beds, visible to each other and to the nursing staff who moved between them. The Nightingale ward, long, well ventilated, with tall windows on both sides and a nurse's station at one end, was designed with sleep in mind, or rather with recovery in mind, and the conditions necessary for recovery in Victorian medical understanding included, prominently, adequate sleep. But the hospital ward at night was not a quiet place. The sounds of other patients, the coughing, the moaning, the restless movement, the occasional cry of pain or distress, created a background of human suffering that made sleep difficult for those who were well enough to be disturbed by it. The hospital night for the conscious patient was often a long and lonely stretch, aware of the other bodies in the ward, aware of the distant sounds of the night nurse moving at the far end of the room, aware of the particular smell of the hospital, carbolic and linen, and the medicinal astringency of the antiseptic preparations that were coming into use in the latter part of the century, and waiting, simply waiting, for the morning to come and the day's activity to begin. The asylum, the Victorian Lunatic Asylum, the institution for the care and containment of the mentally ill, had its own relationship to sleep that reflects both the period's understanding of mental illness and the practical realities of managing large numbers of people with disturbed behavior in an institutional setting. The Victorian Asylum was, in theory, a therapeutic institution, a place where the mentally ill were removed from the stressful conditions of ordinary life and provided with a calm, regular, supervised environment in which their disturbed minds could heal. Sleep was central to this therapeutic vision. The asylum's schedule was built around regular rising and bedtimes, regular meals, regular outdoor exercise, a regulated daily rhythm that was explicitly intended to normalize the mental life of the patients by normalizing the physical routine that supported it. The sleeping arrangements in the asylum were typically dormitory-based for the general patient population, large rooms lined with beds, monitored by attendants who slept in adjacent rooms or in smaller watch rooms from which they could observe the dormitory through a window. The quality of the beds and the bedding in Victorian asylums varied considerably, as did the quality of the institution overall. The better asylums, those run by physicians who took seriously their therapeutic mission, provided clean, adequate beds and made genuine efforts to promote the patient's sleep. The worse ones provided whatever was convenient, and the welfare of the patient in the night was not always the primary consideration. The disturbed sleep of the mentally ill was recognized as both a symptom and a cause of their condition. The manic patient who did not sleep, the depressed patient who could not wake, the paranoid patient who could not relax into the vulnerability of sleep because the night seemed to them full of threats. All of these were recognized patterns in the asylum's clinical experience, and all of them presented practical management challenges. The solutions available were primarily pharmacological, sedatives and opiates, administered under medical supervision to produce the sleep that the patient's own mind could not achieve. The prison had its own relationship to sleep, and it was shaped by the centuries evolving philosophy of punishment and rehabilitation. The early part of the 19th century saw the development, particularly in England and America, of the modern penitentiary, a prison designed not merely to contain criminals, but to reform them, to use the systematic organization of time and experience to produce a different person from the one who had entered. Sleep in the penitentiary was part of this systematization. Prisoners went to bed at a set time and rose at a set time. The cell was designed for individual occupancy, one person, one bed, one space, in the belief that the criminal was best reformed by isolation, by being forced to confront their conscience without the distraction of other criminals to relate to. The isolated cell, the solitary bed, the long night with nothing but the conscience for company, this was the theory. The reality, as reformers discovered over the course of the century, was that enforced isolation produced not moral reform but mental deterioration, depression, hallucination, the gradual dissolution of the self that occurs when the social world is entirely removed. The completely isolated prisoner, sleeping alone in a silent cell, was not sleeping better or more reflectively than the prisoner in a crowded common room. They were sleeping worse and waking to a deteriorating mental state. The reform of the prison system, which continued throughout the century, involved, among other things, a reform of the sleeping arrangements, more humane, less isolating, designed to support the basic biological needs of the prisoner while still maintaining the discipline and the security that the prison's social function required. The literature of sleep, how Victorian writers wrote about the night, and as the night deepens once more, let us enter a different kind of room, the room not of the sleeper, but of the writer, thinking about sleep. The Victorian period produced a literature of extraordinary richness and variety, and within that literature, the theme of sleep in the night occupies a place of surprising prominence. Writers wrote about sleep not merely as a narrative convenience. The character goes to bed, time passes, the character wakes, but as a subject in its own right, deserving of the same careful attention they gave to the great themes of love and money and society and faith. Charles Dickens was perhaps the most comprehensive chronicler of Victorian sleep in all its social dimensions. His novels are full of sleepers and the places they sleep. The debtor's prison, where Mr. Pickwick observes the sorry sleep of the imprisoned, the Thames riverfront, where homeless children curl in doorways, the comfortable middle-class bedroom, where Dommy broods and cannot sleep, the cheap lodgings of Oliver Twist and his companions. Dickens understood sleep as a social fact, something shaped entirely by the conditions of one's life, and he used the quality of a character's sleep as a shorthand for the quality of their existence. There is a passage in Domy and Son in which Dickens describes the sleeping city at night, the street after midnight, the warehouse, the quiet counting house, the last windows going dark, that reads as genuine reportage of the Victorian urban night, observed with the accuracy of a man who had walked those streets himself in the small hours, as Dickens habitually did. He was famously an insomniac, a man who used his sleepless hours for the long nighttime walks through London that are documented in his occasional writings, and his fictional treatment of sleep and the night had behind it the authority of personal experience. Thomas Hardy wrote about sleep as a natural phenomenon. His Wessex novels are full of the sounds and the darkness of the rural night, the sleep of farm laborers who fall into unconsciousness the moment they lie down and wake only when the morning genuinely demands it, the different quality of night in a world close to the soil. Hardy's characters sleep and wake with the movements of an agricultural world, their rest determined not by clocks or convention, but by the actual demands of the land and the animals they serve. George Eliot in Middlemarch wrote the most famous passage about insomnia in the Victorian novel, the meditation on the roar on the other side of silence, that is experienced by those with a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, which is itself too overwhelming for continuous consciousness, so that we walk about well wadded with stupidity. Eliot's understanding of consciousness and its relationship to sleep was philosophical rather than physiological, but it captured something true about the relationship between the capacity for feeling and the difficulty of rest. The night, in Victorian poetry, was a richly worked territory. Tennyson's In Memoriam, the great elegy for Arthur Hallam that occupied Tennyson for 17 years, and that stands as one of the central poems of the Victorian period, is a poem of nights, of lying awake in grief, of the particular quality of grief insomnia in which the mind circles endlessly around the loss and cannot find rest. The images of the winter night, the stars seen from a cold window, the ancient house quiet around the grieving poet, these are images that locate the poem in the specific physical experience of Victorian sleeplessness. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote directly about the experience of insomnia in his essay, A Chapter on Dreams, which describes the relationship between his wakeful imagination and his dreaming one, the way that the stories he told during the day continued into the night in a different register, and the ambiguous gifts of the condition of chronic sleeplessness that had been his since childhood. Stevenson spent many nights of his life unable to sleep for sustained periods, a product partly of his chronic ill health and partly of his intensely active imaginative life, and he wrote about this experience with the specificity of someone who knew it intimately. The ghost story, one of the characteristic literary forms of the Victorian period, in which the night was reliably the setting for uncanny visitation and supernatural disturbance, deserves particular attention for what it reveals about the period's relationship to the sleeping imagination. The ghost story was, at its most effective, a story about sleep and the failure of sleep, about the moment when the boundary between the waking world and the dreaming one becomes permeable, when something from outside the self, or something from the deepest part of the self, intrudes into the bedroom and makes rest impossible. The best Victorian ghost stories, M.R. James is the outstanding example from the later part of the period, achieve their effect precisely because they are so rooted in the specific sensory reality of the bedroom at night. The cold, the darkness, the sounds of the house, the particular vulnerability of a person lying in bed who wakes to find that something in the room has changed. M.R. James wrote from the perspective of a Cambridge scholar sleeping in an unfamiliar bed, a hotel room, a country house, a borrowed flat, and his settings are always extremely specific. The particular view from the window, the character of the furniture, the sounds coming in from outside, the quality of the darkness. This specificity is what makes the intrusion of the uncanny so effective, because the reader has been given a very precise picture of the ordinary, and then watches as the ordinary slowly deforms. The Victorian ghost story was also, implicitly, a meditation on the relationship between sleep and death. The person asleep is, in one of the oldest metaphors in human language, a person temporarily absent from the world, temporarily dead. The ghost, the dead person who returns to inhabit the spaces of the living, is the ultimate insomniac, the person who cannot rest, who is denied the final piece of death as sleep. The Victorian obsession with the ghost story was partly an obsession with what it would mean to be unable to sleep at all, ever, to be permanently conscious, permanently awake, permanently unable to find rest. The pre-Raphaelite artists painted sleep with a reverence that was itself a form of cultural statement. Their sleeping women, Milia's Ophelia floating in her flower-filled stream, which is a very specific kind of sleep. Rossetti's numerous drowsing figures in dim rooms, were images of sleep as a state of heightened beauty and vulnerability, as a threshold condition in which the ordinary social self was suspended, and something more essential, more real, was briefly visible. The poetry of sleep, the explicit attempt to describe the texture of the sleeping consciousness, the dream, the hypnagogic state, was also a feature of Victorian writing. John Keats, whose Ode to a Nightingale we have already mentioned, was the greatest poet of the transition between waking and sleep, of the drowsy numbness that pains even as it soothes. Alfred Tennyson, in The Lodo's Eaters, described sleep as a temptation, a seductive surrender to rest that was both appealing and dangerous, a dissolution of the will and the self that the productive Victorian ethos regarded with simultaneous longing and alarm. All of this, the novels, the poetry, the essays, the ghost stories, reflects a culture that took the experience of sleep seriously as an experience. Not merely a practical necessity, but a state of being with its own quality, its own texture, its own relationship to the deepest aspects of consciousness and identity. The Victorians wrote about sleep as they wrote about love and death and faith, as one of the great mysteries of human existence, deserving of the full resources of literary attention. The servant's bedtime and the dawn rising before the household. In every sense, the night has lasted a long time, and now, gradually, slowly, with the particular quality of light that is specific to the hour before actual dawn, the dark begins to thin. This is the moment when the household begins to stir in its deepest foundation. Not the family, they are still sleeping, will sleep for another hour or two, but the servants. The housemaid whose duty it is to lay and light the fires, the most junior of the household's female staff, the maid of all work in a small household, the under-housemaid in a larger one, wakes. She wakes not because an alarm has called her. Alarm clocks existed from the early 19th century, but their use in servants' quarters was not universal, and many servants woke by the simple training of long habit, their bodies having learned the hour of rising with the reliability of internal clockwork. She wakes, and for a moment she lies in the dark of her attic room and performs the small, private daily act of returning to consciousness. The room is cold. Even in summer, the attic room is cold in the pre-dawn hour. In winter, it is cold enough to make the covers under which she has been sleeping feel like the only warmth in the world, and the act of leaving them requires the particular act of will that is one of the most unromantic but most genuinely demanding of daily moral acts, the decision to leave comfort for cold because the work requires it. She gets up. She dresses quickly, the uniform of her position, the plain dress and apron, the cap that keeps her hair orderly, her fingers numb on the buttons in winter. She takes her candle from the nightstand and lights it. The flame shows her the familiar outlines of her room, the small bed, the chest of drawers, the single chair, and she takes them in with a glance so habitual it barely qualifies as seeing, and she opens the door and goes out into the corridor. The corridor is very dark. The house is completely silent. At this hour, the house belongs to no one, or to the darkness itself. She moves along the corridor with the confidence of someone who knows every floorboard, who has learned to step to the side of the third step on the back stair to avoid the creak that would carry up to the family's rooms, who navigates this daily passage through the sleeping house with a skill that is the product of 1,000 repetitions. She goes down to the kitchen. The kitchen range, the great iron stove that is the heart of the household's domestic operations, has been banked since the previous evening, and her first task is to clear the ashes and rebuild the fire. This is not delicate work. It involves kneeling on the stone floor, opening the grate, removing the ash with a small shovel, laying new coal or wood, and relighting the fire that will heat the water for the morning tea and drive the cold from the kitchen for the day. While the fire is establishing itself, she moves through the rest of the ground floor, the parlor fireplace, the dining room fireplace, laying each with the coal and the paper and the kindling that will be lit when the family comes down. She works in the near silence of the sleeping house, moving as quietly as the task allows, conscious at every moment of the sleepers above. She is conscious of them in a specific way. The sleeping family, the family whose beds she will shortly be entering to collect the chamber pots, to remove the cold ash from their bedroom grates, to provide the hot water for their morning washing. These are people who occupy a world that is inaccessible to her in almost every sense. Their rooms are warmer than hers, their beds are better than hers, their sleep is, presumably, by the evidence of their position and their comfort, less anxious than hers. She tends their sleep as one of her central duties, and in doing so, she makes possible the particular quality of rest that a person can achieve only when the practical world has been managed on their behalf. This is one of the great and largely unacknowledged truths of Victorian domestic life. The comfort of the sleeping family was made possible by the wakefulness of the servants. The ease of falling asleep in a warm bed with clean linen in a well-ordered house was directly dependent on the labor of people who rose before the household and worked after it, who cleaned and tended and prepared and managed so that others could rest undisturbed. The maid with her candle, moving through the dark house in the pre-dawn hour, she is one of the defining images of Victorian domestic life, though she appears in it only obliquely, glimpsed in the background of a story that is nominally about someone else. She is the invisible infrastructure of the Victorian night. By the time the fires are lit and the kettle is on and the first light is beginning to show at the kitchen window, a gray, gradual, tentative light, the light that is not yet day but is no longer quite night, the household begins its slow emergence from sleep. The sounds change. A board creaks above in the family's part of the house. A bell rings in the kitchen, the bell connected by a wire to the bell pull in the master's dressing room. The dog, if there is a dog, stirs and stretches. And the day begins its long, slow preparation for itself. Sleep and the body. Victorian ideas about what sleep actually did. We have been moving through the Victorian night for some time now, and it is perhaps worth pausing, very gently, very slowly, to consider what the people living in that night believed was actually happening to their bodies while they slept. The question of what sleep does, of why the body requires it, of what biological processes it serves, of what is gained during the hours of unconsciousness, is one that modern sleep science has been making genuine progress on for the past several decades. We now know things that the Victorians did not, that sleep is divided into distinct stages, each with different brain activity patterns and different physiological functions. That slow-wave deep sleep is associated with the clearance of metabolic waste products from the brain. That REM sleep is associated with emotional processing and memory consolidation. That sleep deprivation has specific, measurable effects on immune function, metabolic regulation, cardiovascular health, and cognitive performance. None of this was known in the 19th century, and yet the Victorians were not ignorant about sleep. They had, as we have seen, a well-developed set of observations and theories about what sleep required, what promoted it, what disrupted it, and what the consequences of insufficient sleep were. Their theories were wrong in their mechanisms, but often right in their practical implications. And their observations about the relationship between sleep and health were, in many cases, accurate even when the explanations they offered for that relationship were not. The Victorian body, in its relationship to sleep, was understood primarily through the lens of the vital force, the idea that the body possessed a fixed quantity of vital energy that was depleted by the activities of waking life and restored during sleep. This framework, which drew on centuries of medical tradition and on the new physiological thinking of the early 19th century, was simple but not unintelligent as a descriptive account of what people actually experienced: the depletion of waking, the restoration of sleep. That the mechanism of this depletion and restoration was completely different from what the vital force theory proposed did not make the observation itself wrong. The nervous system was the primary site of sleep's action in the Victorian understanding. The brain, which was held to be the seat of consciousness and the controlling organ of the body's activities, was the organ that most required rest, and sleep was understood as the brain's resting state. During sleep, the brain's active engagement with the world, its reception of sense impressions, its processing of thought, its direction of voluntary action, was suspended, and in that suspension, it was restored. This understanding led to the recommendation that we have already noted, that the activities immediately before sleep should not be stimulating to the brain. Reading was acceptable if the material was light. Mathematics and philosophy and scientific study were not. Conversation was acceptable if it was gentle. Argument and intellectual dispute were not. Music was acceptable if it was quiet and soothing. Opera and dance music were not. The hour before bed should be an hour of mental decompression, a gradual slowing of the mental engine in preparation for the sleep that followed. Victorian physicians also recognized, and this is a genuinely sophisticated observation, that the quality of sleep was affected by the mental state of the previous day, not just the previous hour. A person who had been subjected to severe emotional stress during the day, grief, anger, fear, acute anxiety, would find their sleep disturbed even if they had spent the last hour before bed in complete tranquility. The nervous system did not reset instantly. It carried the excitations of the day into the night, and these excitations disturbed sleep in ways that could be observed and measured by the sufferer. The prescription for this problem was partly physiological, the warm bath, the warm milk, the mild sedative, and partly what we might now call cognitive, the deliberate effort to put the disturbing events of the day into perspective before sleep, to use the tools of prayer or of rational reflection to reduce the emotional charge of the day's experiences to a level compatible with rest. This was not always possible, and the Victorian Household Manual acknowledged that it was not, while continuing to recommend the effort as the appropriate first response. The specific physical requirements for healthy sleep were also subjects of considerable interest and some disagreement. The position in which one slept, for instance, was held to be medically significant. Sleeping on the left side was recommended by some authorities, on the grounds that it allowed the heart, which is located slightly to the left, to function without pressure from the weight of the body. Sleeping on the right side was recommended by others, who argued that it allowed the stomach, which empties to the right, to digest more effectively during the night. Sleeping on the back was considered dangerous by many physicians because it was associated with snoring, with the dangerous condition of apnea, though that word was not yet in use, and with the disturbing phenomenon of sleep paralysis, which sometimes occurred more frequently in back sleepers. Sleeping on the stomach was nearly universally condemned, on the grounds that it impeded breathing and placed uncomfortable pressure on the digestive organs. The Victorian medical advice on sleeping position is, in this respect, not entirely at odds with modern recommendations. Sleeping on the back does increase the frequency of snoring and sleep apnea in susceptible individuals, and the left side down position is genuinely recommended for certain cardiac and reflux conditions. The temperature of the body during sleep was another subject of medical interest. It was recognized that the body temperature fell slightly during sleep, that the sleeper was cooler than the waking person, and this cooling was understood as a component of the sleep process itself, not merely a result of lying still. The recommendation that the bedroom should be cool, but not cold, was based partly on this understanding. The bedroom that was too warm prevented the body from achieving the slight cooling that sleep required, while the bedroom that was too cold disrupted sleep by causing shivering and discomfort. The specific recommendation that the feet should be warm when going to bed, often achieved by the bed warmer or the heated brick, was understood in terms of promoting the redistribution of blood away from the core and toward the extremities that was held to be necessary for sleep. This is, remarkably, consistent with modern sleep science, which understands that the dilation of blood vessels in the hands and feet, promoting heat loss from the periphery, is one of the physiological processes that initiate sleep. The Victorian grandmother who insisted on warming the children's feet before bed was following advice that, however imprecise its theoretical basis, was practically sound. The duration of sleep was also a subject of medical opinion. How many hours did a healthy adult require? The general Victorian medical consensus, 7 to 8 hours for most adults, somewhat more for children, somewhat less for very old people, is strikingly consistent with modern recommendations, which suggests that the empirical basis for this advice was solid even if the theoretical apparatus constructed around it was not. The observation that most healthy adults, left to their own devices in an environment that does not interfere with their sleep, will sleep for approximately 7 to 8 hours, is one that 18th and 19th century physicians made from watching their patients, and it has been confirmed by modern sleep research. The consequences of insufficient sleep were recognized in broad outline, if not in detail. Fatigue, difficulty with concentration, increased irritability, susceptibility to illness, all of these were associated with inadequate sleep in Victorian medical writing. The specific mechanisms, the effect of sleep deprivation on cytokine production, on glucose metabolism, on the clearance of amyloid from the brain, were unknown and unknowable with the tools of the period. But the observation that a person who did not sleep enough was less well in multiple ways was made accurately and repeatedly. The Victorian period also saw the beginning of serious scientific interest in sleep disorders. Insomnia, as we have discussed, was well recognized and extensively treated, but other sleep disorders, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, sleepwalking, night terrors, were also described and classified in the medical literature of the period, sometimes under names that no longer exist and sometimes under names that persist to the present day. Somnambulism, sleepwalking, was a subject of considerable fascination in the Victorian period, partly because of its genuine clinical interest and partly because of its resonance with the Gothic imagination. The sleepwalker, moving through the world with the eyes of sleep while the body continued to navigate, was a figure that appeared in Victorian literature as often as in Victorian medicine. Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone used somnambulism as a plot device. Bram Stoker's Dracula had its sleepwalking Lucy, the figure of the sleepwalker, moving through the night in their white nightgown with their blank, open eyes, was one of the period's characteristic images of the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the social self and the animal self that pursued its purposes without the permission of the waking mind. The last hours toward morning, and what the night had held, and as the night comes toward its end, very slowly, with the reluctance that a long night always seems to have about releasing its hold, let us make our way back through the rooms and the hours and the lives we have visited, and consider what we have found. We have spent the night in many different places, in the comfortable parlor of a middle-class Victorian household, watching the fire burn down. In the cold bedroom, watching the candle extinguished and the darkness come. In the nursery, where children slept in their tight, tucked beds under the light eye of the nursemaid. In the servant's attic, where the housemaid slept her abbreviated sleep before rising in the dark to tend the fires. In the lodging house and the tenement. In the stagecoach, rattling through the winter night. In the ship's cabin, listening to the sea. In the hospital ward, waiting for the morning. In the asylum, in the prison, in the grand hotel and the farmhouse on the prairie. We have spoken to doctors and household managers, to insomniacs and dreamers, to servants and their employers. We have looked at the drugs and the folk remedies and the warm baths. We have listened to the literary voices who wrote about the night with such care and such honesty. We have traced the slow, cumulative effect of gas lighting and electric light on the length of the waking day and the shortening of the sleeping night. What we have found in all of this is something that might be described as the complete embeddedness of sleep in the life of its time. Sleep in the 19th century was not separated from the rest of life in the way it tends to be now. It was not a problem to be optimized, a function to be managed, a performance metric to be improved. It was one of the great, unavoidable, deeply human conditions, shaped by the same forces that shaped every other aspect of existence: class, poverty, wealth, gender, health, belief, the season, the weather, the architecture of the house, the availability of coal, the temperament of the nurse. The Victorian sleeper was embedded in a world. The cold bedroom was a consequence of an economic system. The nightcap was a response to an architectural reality. The segmented sleep was a product of the timing of darkness. The laudanum was the answer to an industrial society's insomnia. The maid's pre-dawn waking was the foundation on which the family's comfortable rest was built. Sleep in the 19th century was not a private matter. It was social, historical, material, moral, medical, and literary. It was everything that the people who slept were. And looking at how they slept, how they prepared for it, managed it, failed at it, worried about it, wrote about it, medicated it, accommodated it to the conditions of their lives, we see them, these dead people, with a particular clarity and a particular intimacy. The person in the bed in the dark and the cold, in 1855 or 1870 or 1890, waiting for sleep, they were not so different from the person who watches this in the night, in their own bed, in their own kind of darkness, waiting for exactly the same thing. There is something deeply companionable about this. Across the chasm of a century and a half, across the difference of technology and economics and social structure and medical understanding, across all of that, there is the shared experience of lying down in the dark and waiting for the mind to release its grip and let the night do its work. The night always does its work in the end. The morning body, how Victorians woke, and what the night had made of them before we leave the night behind. Let us stay for just a little longer, just long enough to watch the morning come. It comes so slowly in the Victorian house, and in the Victorian understanding of it, it comes with its own set of responsibilities and pleasures and practical matters. The moment of waking, the return from wherever sleep had taken the sleeper, was understood in the Victorian period as a moment of some significance. Not dramatic significance, but the quiet significance of a daily renewal. The Christian household understood it explicitly as a gift. The morning prayer that followed the evening prayer was a prayer of thanksgiving for having woken, for having survived the night, for being returned to the day's responsibilities and pleasures in a state sufficiently rested to meet them. The household manual that recommended the proper way to go to bed also recommended the proper way to wake. The sleeper should not lurch into wakefulness, but should allow the mind and the body to find each other gradually. The first moments of the morning were to be used not for immediate movement, but for a brief orientation, registering the light, registering the sounds of the house, registering the state of the body. Were there pains? Had the sleep been good? Was the mind clear or muzzy? These questions were to be attended to not anxiously but calmly, as diagnostic information about the self that would inform the management of the day. Then the getting up, which was cold in winter, which has been cold in winter since human beings first had to leave warm sleeping places to face cold mornings, and which will never not be cold in winter, however comfortable the house. The Victorians were honest about this. They did not pretend that getting out of a warm bed on a February morning was pleasant. They argued that it was necessary, and that the discipline of doing it without hesitation was a form of virtue. But they did not claim it was comfortable. The morning routine that followed, the washing, the dressing, the hair, the prayer, was the mirror image of the evening routine, performed in reverse, preparing the self for re-entry into the social world after the night's absence. The washed face, the combed hair, the properly fastened clothes, all of these were the reconstruction of the social self, the daily effort of making the private person into the public one. In the kitchen, the range was hot by now, the kettle singing. The smell of coal smoke and of the first cooking of the day, bread toasting, perhaps, or porridge beginning, moved through the house in the way that morning smells do, calling the sleepers down from wherever they have been. The family assembles around the breakfast table. They are, each of them, people who have been somewhere during the night, somewhere private and interior and largely inaccessible to the others. They bring nothing obvious back from that place, except the rested look in their eyes or the pale circles under them that announce a bad night. They sit down together, and the day begins its negotiations with time and attention and the unending list of things that need to be done. But for a moment, just for a moment, before the day properly starts, there is this: the table, the family, the morning light coming through the window, the sounds of the household finding its rhythm, and behind all of it, like a foundation that has been laid quietly through the long hours of darkness, the night that has just been. The long quiet, a gentle farewell to the 19th century night. We have come a long way tonight, through a long night, through many rooms and many lives and many hours. We have followed the candle from the parlor to the bedroom and watched it extinguished. We have sat by the nursery fire while the children settled. We have listened to the house cool and contract in the small hours. We have walked the pre-dawn corridors with the housemaid. We have traveled by stagecoach and by train and by ship. We have visited the sick room, the asylum, the lodging house, the miners' camp, the farmhouse on the open prairie. And now the night is coming to its end, as nights always come to their ends. The darkness is thinning. It is not quite light yet, but it is becoming less dark, in that almost imperceptible way that only becomes apparent when you have been waiting for it. The birds outside are beginning their tentative first sounds, not the full chorus of the day, but the individual call, the testing of the morning, the preliminary note of a world reconsidering itself. The fire in the parlor is ash. The candles are cold. The beds are warm with the accumulated heat of sleeping bodies, and in those beds all across the century we have been visiting, people are completing their last sleep of the night, the deepest sleep, often the sleep that comes in the hours before morning, when the body has finished most of its restorative work and has surrendered entirely, briefly, into the undemanding depths of the night's last gift. This is the sleep that is hardest to wake from. This is the sleep that people, on a morning with nothing pressing, are most likely to extend, turning over, pulling the covers up, finding a softer position in the now familiar warmth of the bed, and sinking back into the uncomplicated luxury of a few more minutes, or half an hour, or however long the morning allows. We have spent this night together, you and I, in the world of another century. We have been quiet there, mostly. We have moved slowly and listened carefully and tried not to disturb the people who were sleeping. What remains of that world now is mostly documents, letters and diaries and household manuals and medical texts and novels and poetry and parliamentary reports and social surveys, all of them carrying fragments of the lived experience of people who are gone. But the sleep customs they describe, the warm beds in cold rooms, the segmented nights, the nightcaps and the prayers and the laudanum and the smoky candles and the crackling fires and the bell pull by the bed, all of these were real. All of these were the actual texture of actual lives, as real as anything we live, as significant as anything we experience. The 19th century sleeper was not sleeping in a museum. They were sleeping in their life, in their bed, in their night, with whatever that night held for them. And the night held the same things that our nights hold, in its essential character. The darkness, the rest, the dreams, the vulnerability, the mysterious passage through the hours of unconsciousness from which, each morning, we wake again into the world. There is in that continuity, in the fact that the person in the Victorian bedroom and the person in the 21st century bedroom are both doing the same fundamental, unavoidable, deeply necessary thing, something that is, if you let yourself feel it, genuinely moving. We are all, in the end, people who go to sleep and wake up. Across all the distance of time and circumstance and technology and culture, we share this. The night, for all its changes, is still the night. The body, for all its historical specificity, still needs its rest. And so, let the fire in the grate settle into its slow evening pulse. Let the candle throw its last small light against the cold walls. Let the window, with its wooden shutters drawn against the dark, creak once in the wind and then be still. Let the household, in all its human fullness, close its eyes. Let the 19th century night, with all its cold beauty and its specific gravity, spread itself over the sleeping houses and the sleeping fields and the sleeping cities, as it has done every night for the entire length of the century, as it will do in every night that follows, as it is doing right now, somewhere in the world for someone. And let the darkness be, for a little while, complete. That is enough. Rest now. The night is long and the house is quiet, and there is nothing that requires your attention. Rest.